This message is just to indicate that the meeting will be recorded. Well, the rules of the game are as follows. First of all, microphones will be muted unless you speak, and the microphones will be managed, I think, centrally from here. Please use the chat box to communicate with the webinar organizers if you have any comments or want to come in. During the Q&A session, please raise your hand to ask questions, and we will then unmute your microphone. You can also, of course, post questions in the Q&A box or in the chat box. So these are the basic rules, and again, welcome to this launch webinar. We will start in 30 seconds. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Let me first of all start by welcoming the representatives from the Flanders government, Mr. Gert Verreed and Ms. Geraldine Remenans. Welcome to this meeting. We will hear from you in a minute. Also, special welcome to Dr. Marleen Chikuni. She is the AFRIMAP Vice Chair and Coordinator for Southern Africa. Also lined up as a speaker in this opening session. We also have colleagues from headquarters. We have Dr. Miguel Clusener-Godt, who will also be speaking to us in this session. Welcome also to the Secretaries General from UNESCO National Commissions, especially here in the region, government officials who are also linked up. Colleagues from UNESCO, as I said, both in Paris and also here from the region, Be Resilient project partners, colleagues from academia, and also even from the private sector. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon to all of you. My name is Hubert Gijzen. I'm the UNESCO Regional Director for Southern Africa, and I will be your moderator for this opening session. So welcome everyone to this launch event of the Be Resilient project that will be implemented here in the Southern Africa region. This project proposes really the use of biosphere reserves as observatories for climate change adaptation. It is really good to see that so many of you are connected to learn more about this innovative initiative. I can see that we're having over 80 participants already in this event, and the number is growing every minute. So that's a very good turnout. And of course, let me say this: we would, of course, have preferred to have this launch with physical presence of all of you, and preferably in one of the beautiful biosphere reserves here in the region. But we will certainly do that sometime later, once we have come to grips with the COVID-19 pandemic. As you will know, the Southern Africa region certainly has seen its share of extreme hydrological events due to climate change. And just since I came to this region 5 years ago, just in these 5 years, the region has seen a range of extreme hydrological events, both drought events and really extreme drought. You may remember, for instance, that Cape Town was almost running dry. And more recently also the devastating impact of cyclones Idai and Kenneth. I would dare to say that water in the context of climate change is really the defining issue for sustainable development in the region. And therefore, this Be Resilient project is really highly welcome. We will hear more about the project from the speakers in the lineup in this opening session. But before introducing them, I wish to thank all the project partners, and in particular the Flanders government for their support to this important project. The choice to focus on biosphere reserves, I believe, is very strategic. And their use, the use of biosphere reserves as learning and demonstration sites for climate change adaptation, this truly reflects on the role of UNESCO as a laboratory of ideas. And in the Be Resilient project, this means that we facilitate really a sustainability science approach and methodology. And via this methodology, we bring intersectoral, multidisciplinary, and multi-stakeholder approaches towards climate change adaptation. So now let's hear from our speakers in the opening session. And first of all, I would like to introduce my dear colleague, Dr. Miguel Clusener-Godt. He is the Secretary of the UNESCO's Intergovernmental Program, Men and Biosphere, he will be representing the Assistant Director General for Natural Sciences. Miguel, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, dear Hubert, dear Professor Hubert Gijzen, your Regional Director for Southern Africa. Also, dear Mr. Gert Verret and Ms. Geraldine Remenens, representing the Flanders government, and being, as usual, very generous to UNESCO in supporting project. Dear Ms. Marlene Ciccuni, Vice Chair of AFRIMAP and Coordinator for Southern Africa, dear Secretaries from the UNESCO National Commissions, Be Resilient project partners, colleagues from academia and the private sector, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. Also on behalf of the Assistant Director General for Natural Sciences of UNESCO, Ms. Shamila Nair Bedwell, I'd like to tell you that it's a great pleasure to have all of you joining us today to launch this meeting of this Be Resilient project that will be implemented in the southern part of Africa. First, again, let me also express my sincere gratitude and congratulations to the UNESCO Regional Office for Southern Africa and the team for putting this project together. Also wish to congratulate the partners and official representatives, different governments, as well as Biosphere Reserve managers for their contribution in the project development stage, and really invite them to continue supporting this project during its implementation stage. Let me also express my gratitude to the Flanders government, again, for supporting this project financially on the one side, but also to be, I would say, also personally engaged, involved in that. I mean, this is not the first project. You have several ongoing, and I personally feel there's a big commitment from your side to UNESCO activities and project in the Biosphere Reserves. Then I'm also pleased to see such a diverse participation in this program from all the stakeholders, including government, academia, donor community, private sector. all this together will contribute to the success of these projects and really provide the opportunities to dynamic exchanges of ideas and experiences. Hubert already mentioned, and I think there will be some 120, if not more, participants to this event that has already registered and are on board. I think this also shows the importance and really where we are right now. Hubert mentioned the COVID-19 crisis and how these sort of projects are important. Well, ladies and gentlemen, as you know, the African continent has this 2063 Agenda for Prosperity, which is based on inclusive growth and sustainable development. This will include having the capability and tools to drive its own development based on sustainable long-term control of its resources, an equitable use and management of water resources for socio-economic development. In this instance, Africa remains a priority in UNESCO, and climate change is no different. And I can assure you, because today I'm also listening to the executive board of UNESCO, and Priority Africa is top on the agenda, and got also a lot of support, not only from African member states, but from, I would say, almost the entire house of UNESCO. So through the strategy for action on climate change, of course, UNESCO aims to increase the ability of member states to prepare, mitigate, and adapt to water-related impacts of climate change through a multidisciplinary approach. And aligned to this strategy, the UNESCO manages the Biosphere Programme plays, of course, a key role with its World Network of Biosphere Reserves. For what? To act as demonstrative sites for the development of sustainable livelihoods, where people and nature come together. At the same time, they act as locations where ecosystem-based adaptation options can be demonstrated to offset the negative impact of climate change. They are learning areas for sustainable development. They are in a diverse ecological, social, and economic context, touching the life of millions of people living within them. Right now, our estimate, for example, of human beings, people living in Biosphere Reserve, goes around 260 million people worldwide. So in total, there are right now currently 701 Biosphere Reserves in 124 countries, including 21 transboundary Biosphere Reserves that belong to this World Network of Biosphere Reserves. In Southern Africa, there are currently 15 established Biosphere Reserves. It is recognized that climate change impact will manifest itself in local communities through impacts on water security and an increased frequency and of water-related hazards, already mentioned by Hubert, such as droughts, floods, and landslides. This is especially the case for Southern Africa, where extreme droughts and devastating cyclones are on the rise. The UNESCO Intergovernmental Hydrological Programme addresses these challenges and supports the development of tailored solutions to support member states, for example, by supporting climate-informed decision-making and by exploring eco-hydrological solutions, among others. The Be Resilient project launched today is therefore conceived as an interdisciplinary project that engages both the MAP program and the IHP program, the Intergovernmental Hydrological Program, to tailor solutions for the sites, for the Biosphere Reserves in Southern Africa, and to strengthen their communities to address climate change challenges and associated water-related hazards. The project also recognized that the complexity of water-related climate change risks that most countries are dealing with is multidisciplinary and intersectoral. To solve climate-related challenges requires combined expertise from all stakeholders. UNESCO's expertise from its various centers of excellence is harnessed to address impact of climate change and to develop concrete, innovative climate adaptation measures. Particularly, capacities from the Category 1 Center, the ICTP in Trieste, are engaged in this project, as well as those from several Category 2 centers globally. This project cuts across sectors responding to issues related to water, climate change, and biodiversity, and will also have linkages with the education sector through the section on education for sustainable development, as well as with social and human sciences and communication and information sector on inclusive disaster risk reduction, making it an example of truly intersectoral approach. And this, I might say, it's really also in UNESCO pretty innovative, and I think also for the upcoming years, an excellent model of cooperation also for us in-house. But coming back to the sites, the project will empower Biosphere Reserves to act as observatories for climate change adaptation in Southern Africa. Since disasters like droughts, floods, and landslides also occur in these biosphere reserves, the project just seeks to develop and pilot disaster risk reduction tools that could be replicated in other parts of the region. So, ladies and gentlemen, given the complex challenges that our communities are facing due to climatic and other drivers of global change, a collaborative effort is needed to address these issues. Please be assured that UNESCO will continue to work with all stakeholders in looking for innovative solutions to address the adverse impact of climate change. By working together, and when I say working together, is the whole UNESCO community. It is headquarters here, it is all our offices in the countries, it is the Category 2 centers, it is the UNESCO chairs. But by all working together, we will ensure that transformational change, economic empowerment, with shared prosperity for all, will characterize Africa's further development towards the future we want for all people in Africa. I wish you all a most successful and productive meeting, and I thank you very much for listening to me, for your attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Miguel, for these insightful comments, and in particular for emphasizing so much the importance of multidisciplinary, multi-sectoral approaches, and therefore this broad partnership underlying the project. I think that will indeed contribute to the success of its implementation. The next speaker is Mr. Gert Verreet, who is the representative from the Flemish government for this project, and he is based in Belgium at the Department of Economy, Science and Innovation in Flanders in Belgium. Mr. Verreet, the floor is yours.
Dear directors, distinguished participants, colleagues, I hope you can hear me and you can see the slides, the few slides that I have prepared. I'm very honored.
Yes, we hear you loud and clear, and the slides are projected. Yes, please proceed.
Thank you. I'm very honored also to join you at the kickoff of this project. That is one of the key new UNESCO projects that our Flanders government has decided to support. As a civil servant in the Flemish Department for Economy, Science and Innovation, I am responsible for the interaction with the UNESCO sciences sector. I would like to thank profoundly the organizers at UNESCO, not just for this kickoff meeting, for the project, and especially, of course, the Harare office that put its full weight behind this proposal and also behind organizing this event. I hope that this event will cement the basis for a successful project implementation across the whole range of actors that you want to address and take along on this journey. Now, why is a region such as Flanders interested in supporting this sort of UNESCO project? In the science sector, we focus our intervention on areas where the collaborative efforts help to address a more sustainable relation with our natural environment. Often, this also requires a respectful interaction with people from different traditions and different cultures. And UNESCO is a unique global platform where culture, science, and education are really fostered as assets to address societal needs. And this resonates quite well with our competences in the domestic level in Belgium. As a member of the National Commission for UNESCO, I can also say that we find it very important that it is ultimately the citizens who are the real beneficiaries of our interventions and projects. And the fact that the Be Resilient project really will engage with local stakeholders in the areas of the biosphere reserves in your region is a very important component of the project. So we appreciate very much that the project also creates opportunities for science-based cooperation between institutions in our country and in Southern Africa. This is very much in line also with the policy note of our Minister President, who is also our Minister for Foreign Affairs. Now, the Flanders cooperation with UNESCO, as was already mentioned, is underpinned by cooperation agreements and resources that we contribute to trust fund arrangements. The one that I am administratively responsible for, we call the FUST, the Flanders UNESCO Science Trust Fund. And it supports mainly the projects in oceanography, in the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission of UNESCO, in the Man in the Biosphere Programme, and in the Intergovernmental Hydrological Programme. And since last year, we can also support projects in the geosciences. Under that first instrument, we have been able to support a whole range of projects over the last 20 years, many of them on water and on specific ecosystem, and also already a lot on climate challenges. And this historic portfolio represents more than $30 million in support. And we currently support UNESCO at a tune of approximately $1.5 million annually. The slide you see doesn't even include then the 4 major projects which our government has agreed to support in December 2019, which includes this Be Resilient project, and that was a decision that allocated some $4 million altogether to 4 projects. We believe that this sort of funding creates really a lot of value on the ground, and that it acts as leverage for amplifying science-based collaboration in groups of neighboring countries facing common challenges. And we're very happy that the Be Resilient project will project that sort of attitude, that it will bring people together so that they can join forces under a common cause. As I already mentioned, the interest for creating possible opportunities for science cooperation is also one of our motives. And I'm very happy that the project has been able to engage with many institutions across the globe, including a few in Flanders, which will present themselves later during this afternoon. Allow me to salute my compatriots from Leuven University and Vito, and also abroad, because there are quite a few Flemish people in the audience this afternoon. The strength of our region, we're a small region, but it depends very much on the skills of the people. So that's so important that we support education, science, learning, technological development, and other forms of innovation. Let me end my brief introduction just by mentioning one particular institution in Flanders that is not involved in this particular Be Resilient project, but that forms part of the same policy domain as my own department, namely the Messe Botanic Garden, which is shown here just north of Brussels as number 13. I want to show just a few slides to show the many forms that our region tries to make connections with this great continent that is Africa. And I suppose that the Flemish representative in Southern Africa, Mrs. Rijmenans, would probably be able to give much more good examples, because of course through the Foreign Affairs Department we are very much also supporting other types of activities in the Southern African region. But let me just speak about Meissen Botanic Garden, which is closer to my business. So Meissen Botanic Garden is a treasure trove really of botanical knowledge near Brussels. The assets includes living collections, seed banks, etc. And the Institute as such is thus a real enabler for biodiversity research. In its public functions, it also allows the visiting public to learn about the living wonders of the natural world, plants from all around the world. And in its research mission, it has already been active in many African biosphere reserves, as shown on this map. As I said, this institute is currently not actively engaged in the Be Resilient project, but the slide also shows that really the Man in the Biosphere program as such is also an enabler for a lot of international scientific cooperation, and that institutes in our region, some of which you will hear about later, are contributing in their own ways to useful knowledge that helps to manage our relation with these biosphere reserves. To conclude, Mr. Chairman, I'm very happy that the Be Resilient project can start despite all the practical difficulties that the COVID-19 pandemic causes. And I hope that it will be really an inspirational adventure for many people in Southern Africa and elsewhere, and that it will boost their capabilities for action and enhance also the value to the local population of those precious biosphere reserves. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Verreed, for these encouraging remarks, and also for summarizing for us the history of the cooperation between Flanders and UNESCO, the very productive relationship that we have. So it was good to hear that, and also to hear about the scope of our cooperation, and that puts this new project in context. So thank you very much for that, and we certainly look forward to our strong collaboration under this joint initiative. And this brings us to the last speaker in the opening session, which is Dr. Marleen Chikuni, who is the AfriMap Vice Chair and Coordinator for Southern Africa. She holds a PhD in plant sciences from the University of Reading in the UK, and she is currently based in Malawi in the Biological Sciences Department at the University of Malawi. Marleen, Dr. Chikuni, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you all. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear. Please proceed.
Okay, thank you. I just got a note to say that my internet connection is unstable, so I wasn't sure whether you could get me. Good afternoon, all, and greetings from Malawi, the warm heart of Africa. Trusting we're all keeping safe. As it has already been pointed out, I am the AfriMap Vice Chair and Coordinator for Southern Africa. I was asked to say a few words related to the AfriMap conference that we had in Côte d'Ivoire, which I attended. The theme was contribution of biosphere reserves in sustainable development in the context of climate change. The meeting was attended by delegates from over 26 countries, comprising MAB national committees, MAB focuses, biosphere reserve managers, international NGOs, UNESCO, NatComs, and several line ministries, including environment, agriculture, and education. The objectives of the meeting mainly were to develop and strengthen capacities of MAB national committees, because it has been observed in the past meetings that there was a weakness, there was no coordination, and so activities within Biosphere Reserves were not proceeding as they were supposed to. But also the participants shared strategies leading to protection of Biosphere Reserves, mainly in restoration and ecological rehabilitation of these reserves due to natural and anthropogenic threats. As part of the meeting, we also visited a scientific nature reserve, which is a prospective biosphere reserve in Côte d'Ivoire, where we were able to see how they have integrated education, research, and monitoring. So they do have postgraduate students who are engaged in climate-related research for both flora and fauna, but also they do monitoring by studying ecological changes in the nature reserve. The reserve is an interesting part because it has got savanna and rainforest patches. So they have been doing studies for the past 30 years, and they have been able to document effects of climate change. So that was nice and educative for us to see. But they also do have collect meteorological records which inform different policies related to climate within Côte d'Ivoire. So it is an institute that has been there for some time, and they have been able to use the research, the data that they produce, to upscale it and use it for the country. I noticed that this project, the Be Resilient project that has been proposed, has got 4 main components, which have been already outlined, and I want to agree with our moderator, Dr. Hubert Gijzen, who said that the project will address concerns in the various biosphere reserves within Southern Africa. The 4 areas related to community engagement and citizen science, which I think will go a long way to empower communities so that they can solve their own problems. I am a member of the RCE, Regional Centers of Expertise on ESD, and the main emphasis is that you act local, but you think global. And I think this project also does follow in that you are letting people within their own region try to come up with solutions that would be applicable to them. The natural resources that we have across Southern Africa are almost similar, and the kind of challenges that we meet also tend to be similar. So when we meet as a region, we try to share our experiences, but also we try to learn from one another on how you can address the different challenges. I think we welcome this project because it is timely. We are undergoing effects of climate change. It is also multidisciplinary. We don't work in a vacuum. As you know, biosphere reserves, you are within communities, and you let people utilize resources, but in a sustainable manner. So it's not just the academics, it's not only the social aspect, but you have everybody else bringing in their expertise, and that will be very useful. I've already touched on community engagement in the ESD, Education for Sustainable Development. Indeed, we rely on the formal, informal, as well as informal knowledge that would inform on how we use the natural resources. As you might be aware, most of the population is rural, for example, in Malawi, and we depend on the natural resources for livelihoods. So when you have challenges in sustaining usage of these resources that will impact on how future generations would benefit, but also that would impact on sustainable development. How do we achieve the 17 sustainable development goals? You don't just focus on one goal, because these goals are complementary and they are interlinked. So as we focus, as the project has isolated SDGs 1, 6, 13, 11, 17, but I think even everything that is contained within the SDGs has been captured within this project. The emphasis on partnerships cannot be overemphasized, because the natural disasters, the impacts of climate change, no boundaries. What happens in Mozambique will affect Malawi, will affect people in Zimbabwe and the like. So we do need those transboundary partnerships for us to work as a unit. I am excited that there is greater participation within this webinar meeting, within this launch. I hope there will be a lot of input on how we can refine, but also how we work as a group as we try to implement this project. We in Southern Africa indeed need all the support that we can get. Hence, I was excited when the Secretary for MAB from UNESCO headquarters said that Africa is a priority. I think we look forward to continued support. And also Flanders has just pledged their support, and I note that much of the funding is from them. I would like to thank them also, and look forward to continued support for future endeavors. I think that's what I can say for now, as welcome words from Southern Africa. We are glad that you have chosen our region to pilot this project, and we hope that we won't disappoint. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chikuni, from the warm heart of Africa, Malawi. This was really very informative, and it really helps to position this project in a regional context. And I must say I was also very happy with your reference and the importance on education for sustainable development. So these practices and results need to be translated also into and integrated into our education systems. So thanks again. And with these opening remarks from our three distinguished speakers, I really consider this meeting formally opened, but also I consider the project formally launched. I would say again, congratulations to all the partners, and we look forward to the successful implementation of this project and to a very productive partnership. And this brings me to the close of this opening session. Please stay on board. There's a whole program following, but the opening session is being closed, and I hand over to my colleague, Dr. Koen Verbiest. He is the science program specialist for the region in this regional office, and he is specifically concerned with our work in the area of environmental sciences and water. So let me wish you a most productive and successful meeting this afternoon. Over to Koen.
Thank you very much, Hubert. Can I just take the mic a bit closer? All right, thank you very much. I would just like to give a warm welcome to all participants. If all goes well, we have around 120 participants from 9 countries of the region. So I would think this is quite an interesting turnout for the start of the project, and also giving us a good credit to work together on this project. Of course, I would like to thank the Flemish government specifically because of the support, continued support for years already to UNESCO, and particularly in this case to Southern Africa through the IHP and the MAP program. Under different conditions, we would have met the last few days already in the Middle Zambezi Biosphere Reserve. We would have wanted to host this kickoff meeting on the border between Zimbabwe and Zambia. We would have had working sessions with you where we would actually explore potential for fine-tuning the work plan and align the project to the local needs in all of the biosphere reserves. Unfortunately, we live currently in a different world, and we had to go for a different format. In this case, we opted for a kickoff meeting where we are today, which will give a very brief introduction to all the topics we would like to work on in the next 3 years. But also we would like to have follow-up meetings in the next 2 to 3 months. So we'll spread out the 2 to 3 days into 2 to 3 months, where we actually will work with you on each of the topics that we will identify today to identify which topics would be of interest to work with you in a more close relation. So take this as an introduction, and of course we will have follow-up activities after this kickoff meeting. Maybe just one housekeeping message is that questions can still be asked during the presentations, and we will briefly answer them, let's say, by the presenters. But during the Q&A session, we will give you the floor. So if you have more elaborate questions you would like to ask yourself, keep them for the Q&A session. But if you have more technical, to-the-point questions that the presenters can directly answer, then I would say please put them in the Q&A box that is available to you, and then we can answer them just after each presentation. All right, let's see if this can be moved ahead. So yeah, we're just giving you the rationale and the feedback, the background. I think we have to do that. If you can just next slide. Right. I don't need to do it. All right.
It should work.
All right, I'll just present
the screen.
Right. Okay, this is working now. Perfect. So in terms of rationale and background, why did we develop this project? Of course, we know that Southern African region is highly vulnerable to disaster hazards caused by climate, which often result in severe impacts on the local communities. And I think that was also highlighted more recently when we were drafting this project. We just came out of the cyclone Idai, where actually we highlighted and identified that flood monitoring and early warning is largely insufficient, resulting in acute threat to human security. But also more frequent and more severe droughts have affected almost all countries in Southern Africa over the last 3 years. So these climate-related hazards and risks are expected to further increase in the following decades, as it is expected that climate change will increase the frequency and intensities of cyclones and droughts. Of course, it means that we need to move to a different way of addressing things, and that we need to go towards proactive disaster risk management and better prepare communities for similar events in the future. So in this sense, if you just look at this, for example, which is the landslides, it's just impressive to see that so many villages were affected by these landslides in an area which is also currently becoming potential biosphere reserve. So we do have those events affecting the biosphere reserves, and we must make sure we also prepare and make a proactive disaster risk management possible in those sites. So the project itself has been already introduced, funded by the government of Flanders, and it will involve established as well as proposed biosphere reserves in Southern Africa. This is quite a lot of sites, and of course we would like to work with you to prioritize some of the actions in some of the areas. But we feel that also by using the full network of current and future potential sites, we actually can start coming together as a group, as a network, where basically we can start identifying regional initiatives that can actually be implemented throughout the region. So the objective of this project is to strengthen the role of biosphere reserves in Southern Africa, to become observatories for climate change and adaptation, and to act as drivers of change and demonstration learning sites for sustainable development and disaster risk reduction. This is in line with their mandates and with the Lima Action Plan that has been identified in the MAP program and subscribed by all member states. This project also, of course, addresses the SDGs, and these are the most important ones that we would like to address, specifically SDG 6 on water, 13 specifically on climate action, and 15 life on land, which of course involves a biosphere reserve model. But also we address some targets in the SDG 1 on poverty, as well as on sustainable communities, and of course the partnerships SDG. But also specifically in terms of gender, we have an intention to gender mainstream throughout the whole project, and ensuring that gender will be integrated in planning, programming, implementation, and evaluation activities to ensure that we have a gender-balanced approach in implementation on the ground. So in terms of implementation strategy, I will be quite brief, and I will give the heavy lifting to my colleagues who will follow me hereafter. But in fact, it will look around 4 topics. One is about climate change impact assessment. The other one is about tool development for disaster risk reduction. Education for sustainable development was already mentioned, and citizen science to ensure we have the linkages with the local communities and we empower them to be part of the solutions. But also we would like to use this project to give the Man and Biosphere Reserve the strength that it needs and it deserves in this region. And I think by also providing a separate support in that line, we hope to have a more effective MAP program with many more members and many more biosphere reserves in the next 3 years. Just briefly, I will touch upon each of the axes before I give the word to our specialists that also are on the call. In terms of climate change impact assessment, we will take a 2-tiered approach. On one hand, we will look into analysis. We would like to understand specifically the expected impacts at the regional level, building, of course, on available information. A lot has been done over the last decade already. We want to also understand what the impact will be on the biosphere reserve specifically. But also would like to dig in deeper and look into local assessments of climate change risk and also identifying potential adaptation strategies for those locations. But we also feel that the Biosphere Reserve have a unique location and mandate in which they can actually function as locations for identifying indicators for climate change impact as well as adaptation, and to keep monitoring them to identify trends and changes. So we believe that using the Biosphere Reserves as observatories for climate change impacts is actually the way forward. We already mentioned some of the hazards that have been identified as key in this region, and we'd like to work on all of them. In fact, we would like to invite and involve our sister agency, ICTP, which is actually a part of UNESCO, which is a top-notch scientific body looking at physics as well as other applied applications. And in fact, they're one of the leaders in this new field of subseasonal to seasonal forecasting, which has the potential to provide climate information for a time period which is explicitly important for farmer communities and crop-specific operation, which is actually the 30 to 60 days ahead of us, which is actually where decisions have to be made today and will, of course, be affected by that time span. So we would like to have tools available that can actually provide us information for better management of our forestry and agriculture. So in terms of food and drought risk, we also have a very strong partner from Flanders on board, which is the Flemish Institute for Technological Research, which actually owns its own satellite and is actually helping us to identify the potential for crop monitoring and to optimize crop yields under variable climates using artificial intelligence and other algorithms. So we'll have a bit of a specific talk on that, on what is currently available and what's in the pipeline to support also local communities in this sense. In terms of flood and drought risk management, we also have an important partner that we have been working in for more than a decade with Princeton University as well as Southampton University, with whom we have been developing all over the globe operational flood and drought monitors and early warning systems, basically developing tailored flood prediction tools, which we would like to also focus in this case on the biosphere reserves that have those challenges. In terms of landslides, we have seen already that last year many landslides were triggered by Idai, but we also see that actually there's a lot of overlap between biosphere reserves and landslide hazards. So we would like to validate and improve landslide susceptibility maps throughout the region and construct and analyze an inventory of landslides that are triggered by extreme weather events, so we can actually identify what triggers those events. And this, of course, helps us to move forward towards landslide risk assessment, as well as potentially early warning approaches to strengthen these capacities and to safeguard our communities in the biosphere reserves. And also, of course, in terms of education sustainable development, some work has been done already as part of the MAP program. But we feel there's really a potential to let learners and teachers use their current environments, the natural environments, the cultural heritage inside their biosphere reserves as learning environments to teach more comprehensive, more global, more holistic views of natural systems, where of course people are part of. And we feel, for example, that there's a lot of opportunities we can do to working together with the education sector to really make that case. And we've started already in some pilot countries with support from the Swedish Development Corporation. And we hope that also with this project, we can extend that work and make sure that we work with all biosphere reserves and use this kind of learning environment to really teach about education for sustainable development. Additionally, we also want to involve citizens. And we already mentioned citizen science as one opportunity to engage citizens. And one of our colleagues will also elaborate on the potential of that work in the biosphere reserves. And just maybe to finalize, we also, of course, want to strengthen the Man and Biosphere Programme. So who is this? In fact, at this point, we have 15 biosphere reserves since 1998 until last year. And I know there's quite a few in the pipeline. So we also know that beyond these 15 biosphere reserves which have been established, we also look at a list of potential locations, which hopefully some of them will materialize during the project execution. And we work with the partners and with the countries to make that happen. But also importantly, there's quite a few potential transboundary ones that could emerge from this new list of biosphere reserves. Currently, we don't have any transboundary one, but we hope also that the project, through support of dialogues, can actually establish transboundary collaboration between countries in the region around the Man and Biosphere Programme. We also have some preliminary work done last year in our Maputo meeting when we had all the MAP committees and the national commissions of UNESCO present, where we started identifying potential locations for implementation of some of these key elements of the project. But in fact, that exercise was something we're going to redo during the kickoff meeting. And unfortunately, this will have to be happening in the next few months, where we actually sit down around each of those teams and we start identifying where we can actually do some of the work of this project. So this list, although it was submitted as a preliminary one, I think needs revision, but it also is a good starting point of identifying where certain, let's say, challenges already occur. And just to finalize, I would like to thank our project partners, and actually that's all of you. We of course have the MAP program, the IHP program, which actually brings together a huge network in the region already, and many of you of this in this call are actually part of that. And of course, we have also the international partners that will support us in this scientific work. Being a scientific program, this is very important, and to ensure we have the right gender perspective in all of that work. So with that, I would like to stop here. And with permission, I would like to continue inviting some of the speakers. So remind me that if you have any questions specifically that can be answered by the presenters, you can already put that in the Q&A, while we have a specific Q&A session later on. Okay, so I would like to invite our next speaker, Dr. John Matthews. He's the Executive Director of the Alliance Global. Okay. All right, so we have two questions already, so I will just answer them first before we continue. So the question is, how are the biosphere reserve sites chosen? I think I answered the question by saying that we did a preliminary selection together with all the MAP representatives in our Maputo meeting last year. But I would say that this list is preliminary, and this is actually one of the reasons why I would like to have follow-up meetings, where we, for each topic, will have separate discussions and where we basically will identify the sites where we do active work. So I think that decision is still to be taken, and we of course would work with you to make that decision. And of course the question is, when exactly will it start? Today is the official start, and we will have several events coming after this to kickstart the implementation, of which you will be informed subsequently. The duration will be 36 months at least. So I'll continue with my introduction of Dr. John Matthews, who is the Executive Director for the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation, AGWA. He's based in the US, but he's also co-chaired by the World Bank and Stockholm International Water Institute. I would like to welcome John Matthews to the floor, please.
Thanks very much. I hope you can see my screen all right.
Yes, we can. We hear you well. Go ahead.
Super. I really appreciate that, Koen. And I'm also really grateful to be invited. I'm on the Pacific coast of North America. I'm really sorry that I am not in Southern Africa right now. I've been there many times and I really enjoy working there. And I'm also pleased to see the names of many friends and colleagues in attendance. I want to start, I've been really inspired listening to the talk so far, and the idea of biosphere reserves as observatories, I think, is really intriguing. I think maybe with my talk, we're going to be switching to thinking of them as laboratories for climate adaptation, not just as observatories of climate impacts. And that's because we're really compelled to make decisions now about what kinds of a future we want these reserves to look like as we move through many climate impacts that we're deeply committed to because of all the atmospheric changes that have occurred and will continue to occur. Just a quick word about our organization. We're based in North America, but we operate globally. We're called AGWA, Alliance for Global Water Adaptation. It's a network. We do a lot of crowdsourcing and knowledge synthesis. Most of our membership is made up of water and climate professionals. We've, especially with UNESCO, done a lot of work in Africa already together, as well as in Central and South America. We're co-chaired by the World Bank and by a Swedish water think tank called SIWI, Stockholm International Water Institute. And I'd like to start off with just a quick quote. We build things that last 300 years. Why don't we think about sustainability for that long? So that's a quote that I heard from a senior manager at the World Bank. But I think it actually is also deeply relevant to how we think about biosphere reserves. We often have a very short-term view about how to sustain these systems, but ecologically and the communities that are around them, they don't last in a 5 or 10 year increment. They last in centuries. And we should think about these long-term trajectories, especially because of the amount of climate change that we have experienced and that we will continue to experience through at least the rest of this century. And the issues around water and climate adaptation for water are really central to that question. And we have managed water in a way that I would argue is actually singularly inappropriate for a rapidly shifting climate. It doesn't really matter where you are in the world. We basically use the same framework for managing water resources. And it comes from a team that was working in the 1950s and early 1960s called the Harvard Water Project. And they created an approach that essentially uses the past to tell us what's going to happen in the future. It's very focused on infrastructure. It's very focused on how we optimize. We basically envision a single future. And as you can see here in a quote from the text, it focuses on one best design for any physical environment. And the problem is now that we don't know what one best design should look like. The future really has a lot of uncertainty, especially if we're thinking over more than 10 or 20 years. We're thinking over those longer timescales about what sustainability, even kind of deep sustainability, really means. And for water in particular, we have a kind of contradiction that we often really need numbers. We need to give a number to an engineer. We need to give a number to a planner, often a price to a decision maker based on an economic analysis. But our faith in those numbers is rapidly reducing because climate change is not a straight line. It's a wandering path, and how we navigate that is really critical. And I would strongly argue, especially with these biosphere reserves, that both ecosystems and infrastructure have a really low tolerance for failure in that context. The way that we've thought about decision making for water resources, we now call a top-down decision making. It really starts with often a high-level decision maker, maybe a politician, the head of an agency, who's saying, this is what our problem is, handing it off to a technical analyst who develops a single solution, and then it's essentially presented to users as stakeholders, including ecosystems as a stakeholder, and we have to live with it. And that a single solution may not match where the future is, and it may also not be very appropriate for the stakeholders or the ecosystem and how they view the problem. It's often a very narrow, single-purpose type of solution. Over the last 12 years or so, we've seen a really radical shift, and I want to commend UNESCO in recognizing this shift and embracing this in much of their water sciences work over the last few years. And this is the shift to bottom-up decision making, and it's a non-optimized approach. We're not looking for a single solution anymore, and it really starts with the users and stakeholders, often a technical person such as myself or Koen, that are working with the users and stakeholders to really define what a problem or need looks like. It means developing a range of solutions that we can evaluate how effective they'll be across a broad set of potential climate futures. And then the decision maker may pick one, may pick more than one solutions in the end that might work in sequence. And what we see in practice is that when we start with the users, with the stakeholders, when we're thinking about ecosystems at that early stage, we often define a bigger problem, a more comprehensive and holistic problem, which is really one of the issues that we've identified as a decision-making issue for many decades. Bottom-up decision support is still relatively new. There are not that many publications that have come out in that area. The first one that I'm aware of that was a really systematic approach came from the World Bank in 2015, Confronting Climate Uncertainty in Water Resources Planning and Project Design. That's been used in many dozens of projects for billions US around the world. And in 2018, late 2018, UNESCO published CRIDA, Climate Risk Informed Decision Analysis, which is not focused on a specific institution like the World Bank, but really on decision makers who are interested in a bottom-up approach more generally. CRIDA has been used, by my count, in at least 24 countries since 2018, all over the world, including a number of projects in Africa. And there are a few qualities that I think are especially relevant to the concept of working in a place like a biosphere reserve. We have very limited data, both in terms of its quality and quantity. It's not just the uncertainties around the climate that are an issue, it's also the ecological uncertainties that are really significant. It uses a definition of resilience that has two main components: robustness and flexibility. Robustness is preparing for the impacts that we're directly worried about, that we're pretty sure are going to happen. We may think an area is going to get drier, for instance. Flexibility is how we deal with all that residual uncertainty. And we also spend some time talking about finance, because finance, it shouldn't be an afterthought. How we pay for things actually should be something that's integrated with our operations so that it actually supports and enables best practices. So CRIDA, who is it for? We identify our critical audience, our main audience for CRIDA as what we call the analysts. These are often the technical decision makers that are involved in defining projects. They're the ones that maybe as an engineer or a planner, they don't have a lot of experience in terms of working with stakeholders. And they particularly need help with that translation process. The need that we identified as much as 8 or 9 years ago is that there has to be a structured and practical approach. We have to be tolerant of limited data and recognize that that even though climate change is not new, climate adaptation is new. And we literally started off our development meetings for CRIDA by saying, can CRIDA work in Rwanda? Can it work in Nepal? Can it work in places maybe where data history is limited, where these processes are quite new? What are the institutional limits? In this, we also recognize that institutions may not be willing or able to make radical shifts in how they work, especially if they've been doing top-down approaches for a long time. So that you can adopt CRIDA in a modular way, picking and choosing as your institution feels comfortable and decides to reorient. And the goal, of course, is to institutionalize these things so that institutions don't just make one-off good decisions, they make consistent decisions. And the climate adaptation is really mainstreamed. A little bit on the process. It starts with a shared vision. The technical analyst helps develop a set of quantitative performance indicators. These are passed through a stress test, and you make two types of decisions. One is a robust solution, as I mentioned, to the high confidence, the climate impacts that you can see, and the second are flexible solutions to deal with all the uncertainty. Say with if you're not sure if both floods and droughts may both be increasing rather than just droughts. So that we don't get locked in to one single route. And we try to use what we think of as the best methods for each of these categories. Decision scaling methodology that was developed with the Army Corps in the US, and adaptation pathways developed in the Netherlands by the Rijkswaterstaat and Deltatis. We also think that ecosystems are just absolutely critical. It's not just an infrastructure-based approach. Ecosystems are the landscape, the kind of playing field in which adaptation really occurs. It's a natural capital, and how we integrate ecosystems, especially for biosphere reserves, is really critical. This is essential to how we think of a bigger problem, a more coherent problem, a problem that can last for centuries. These are just quick examples of what these methodologies look like in practice. A few quick examples. The state of California in the US has recently adopted CRIDA at the state level. California is almost like its own country, and they're developing some really massive CRIDA projects. This one linked here is on the Merced River. And it integrates, this is a place where the snowpack is really disappearing, like in some of the mountainous areas in South Africa, in Southern Africa, and links the increasingly flashy nature of the rivers there, because there's not a lot of frozen storage during the dry season, to working with landowners to recharge the aquifer. And so it's a managed aquifer recharge. It deals with both increased floods and reduces drought risk as well in a very quantitative, highly integrated method. One of the very first CRIDA projects actually was with a water utility in Lusaka. And this was particularly identifying how the electricity that came from hydropower and the limitations there in the plant operations were a very significant risk. It's a great project that's gone to completion already and is viewed as a really important success for the reliability of this water treatment facility. In Mexico, this is a project with Kuhn. This was looking at 300 basins and trying to make sure that we were using the environmental flows as an instrument for climate adaptation in those 300 basins. This is well in process. And I think very relevant for Southern Africa, we used a performance indicator looking at ecological drought as a way to help us gauge the water use for the communities, for farmers, for energy production and fisheries. What is it that we're trying to count here? And this is where some of the newest thinking is starting to emerge. Mexico is a good example of this. In a traditional approach, as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, we tend to be very retrospective. We tend to look at the past as a set of targets that we should manage backwards towards. The year 2000, 1950, that was the better time. That doesn't work anymore. Resilience is about managing with change. And the categories of indicators that we need to use to help us make more resilient decisions are areas like managing for variability, managing for heterogeneity, and managing for connectivity. These are quite different than simply looking at quantity and quality for water. These really supplement and engage those, but governance is important too. We need to be able to think at a basin, sometimes at a system scale, and how to make our decision. I just want to acknowledge in print many colleagues that have been working on CRIDA, not least Koen, who's the kind of spiritual leader for CRIDA in many ways. And I thank you and welcome your questions later in the session.
Thank you very much for that. And I don't really think of myself as a spiritual leader, but thanks for that anyway. I don't see any questions for now in the Q&A box, so we'll keep the questions for later than for this topic in the Q&A session. So please hang on there, John. And we'd like to move to this next session where we talk about disaster risk reduction tools. And the first speaker will be Dr. Justin Sheffield, and he's a professor of hydrology and remote sensing at the University of Southampton in the UK. And he forms also part of the Princeton Climate Analytics, where he was based before 2016. So I would like to give the floor to Justin to give us a bit more information about flood and drought monitoring and early warning systems that we are currently developing together. Please go ahead, Justin.
Yeah, thanks, Koen. Hi, everybody, and thanks for the opportunity to talk here. Let me just see if I can share my screen. So I'm just going to rearrange a few windows and can you see that screen okay?
Yes, that works. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm going to switch off my video. My connection isn't too great today, so, and then, okay. So yeah, so great to be here. I'm going to talk about early warning systems from the perspective of flood and drought hazards. So this is work that I've been involved with for quite a number of years now, originally at Princeton University, where I was for about 16 years. Now I'm at the University of Southampton in the UK, and this work has also been operationalized in some sense through a company, Princeton Climate Analytics, and also an institute, Princeton Climate Institute, which is the purpose there is really to bring together researchers and collaborators to try to move forward with this type of work. And of course, a lot of this has happened in partnership with UNESCO IHP, and I think it was back in 2008 that we first started trying to develop these systems for sub-Saharan Africa. So the partnership with IHP has been fantastic in moving this along. So we're really happy to be involved with this project and really looking forward to working with IHP on it. So we know that droughts and floods have a lot of impacts, and arguably some of the most impacts of all natural hazards in terms of number of people affected and the longer term economic costs, but also the ecosystem stresses as well, which in some ways are hard to define and quantify as well. So you can have a bit of a tour around this slide here, looking at all the different types of impacts, and these affect countries and populations and systems all around the world in very different ways. You can have impacts on water levels and supply, and that can impact infrastructure. Flood impacts on bridges, and that can be really detrimental to local populations in terms of moving about, trade, and so on. There can be direct impacts on things like tourism in terms of lake levels, and there can be lots of impacts on energy production. So hydropower and also thermoelectric electricity production as well is highly affected by drought impacts on cooling water. There's obvious impacts on agriculture, forestry, and fisheries, increased livestock mortality rates as well. Waterlogging and flooding can be very detrimental to agricultural production as well. And there are indirect and direct impacts on public health. Obviously, through flooding, we can have impacts on spreads of disease. There can also be public health impacts from droughts, including air quality, but there can also be trickle-down effects in the longer term into mental health as well, especially when we have long-term droughts, and we've seen that in many regions of the world, especially in the agricultural community. And then lots of impacts to ecosystems, so damage to wildlife habitat, and a good example is impacts to forestry, so fire hazard and even tree die-off, especially if it's combined with other hazards. So how do we manage the impacts of floods and droughts and other hazards we could put in here as well? So this slide kind of shows us two perspectives. So often we approach this from the bottom side of this figure, so it's really a kind of reactive approach where we're kind of managing the hazard, the impacts of the hazard. It's kind of a crisis management way of handling things, so that when the disaster happens, we're actually assessing the impact, and then we're responding to that, and that ends up with some kind of recovery and reconstruction. Whereas where we would like to be is in the top half of this diagram, in a more proactive mode, where we're really managing the risk, and that can be done in many different ways, including mitigating it, being prepared for it, so that when the disaster comes, those risks have been transferred, reduced in some way. And a key part of this is prediction and early warning. And just to emphasize, that is one part of many different things that should be done to reduce the impacts and the risks from these types of disasters. So early warning is essentially giving us a forewarning of what might happen, but that's not just about that warning, it's also about some other elements here as well. So you can boil it down to maybe 4 aspects. So we have the monitoring and warning service, which is mostly what I'm going to talk about for the rest of this presentation. So that's really about monitoring the hazards as they evolve, but also forecasting into the future and actually making some kind of prediction about whether the hazard will evolve, how serious it's going to be, who it's going to potentially impact, which systems it's going to impact. But that has to go hand in hand with some other elements, other components of an early warning system. First and foremost, it has to be based on some kind of knowledge of the existing risk. So that requires undertaking risk assessments to understand how hazards have occurred in the past, what's exposed to that, and the vulnerabilities of the systems, the populations, the ecosystems as well, and also how that's changing over time. So we heard in the previous talk a little bit about non-stationarity in the climate, and also in vulnerabilities in exposure as well. So populations change and ecosystems change as well. This is not just about climate change affecting systems. So that risk knowledge is really important as well to help us interpret the monitoring and warning that we get in kind of operational real-time terms. And once we have that information, then we need to be able to disseminate and communicate. So we need to provide that risk information and early warnings. So there's a lot that needs to be included in any early warning system to ensure that that information is given out in the right kind of way, that people can understand it and it's clear and usable as well. And then of course, we can't manage or reduce risks unless we have some kind of capability to respond. So that means there needs to be some kind of national or community level plans in place so that when a warning comes along, we can actually do something about it. And then on the right, there is a bunch of cross-cutting factors in there in terms of things like institutional arrangements and governance that feeds into all these components. And we also have to think about this in the multi-hazard perspective. So hazards do happen often on their own, but they may be on the back of another type of hazard, which changes the vulnerability of the system we're thinking about. And then getting back to John's talk from the bottom-up perspective, having that local community involvement is really important. These are the people who are going to be affected, so there needs to be that bottom-up perspective in how these systems are put together and the purpose of them. So how can forecasts be used? So things, I guess, are quite obvious. If we provide a flood forecast, then that can be provided to communities. And if the plans are in place, then the community can actually go to higher ground, for example. They can put in barriers and so on to stop the floods impacting on fields or infrastructure and so on. If we have stream flow forecasts, then that's really important for energy management. As I mentioned before, things like hydropower, thermoelectric plants, you know, can we switch to other forms of energy production if we know we're not going to have enough water to cool the plant? This also relates to reservoir management, which is often about hydropower, but also about flood mitigation as well, so, and water supply. So a reservoir can release or save water if a flood or a drought is forecast. There's lots of applications to agriculture around water, but also decision-making on what to plant and when to plant, also how to store food, and all of those things come into food security more broadly. We hear lots about new systems that are giving us precision agriculture, and part of that is forecasting as well. So how can we schedule irrigation or fertilizer application and so on? And there are many other examples that we can think about. If we have a good enough forecast with some reliability or robustness, then there are decisions that can be made based on that information to save money, increase yields, and so on. And there are a few other examples there, things like tourism, transport, retail planning even, and also long-term planning, which is often around financial investments that can be informed by seasonal or longer-term forecasts and early warning. So there's a lot going on in this, so I'll just go through it step by step. There's really some results that have come from a modeling study, being a crop model, to understand how yields are affected by planting date. So planting date along the bottom of the two figures, and this is being calculated for types of years, different years. Each of those is different in terms of the climate. So some may be normal, some may be wetter than normal, drier than normal, and coloured kind of boxes on each of the diagram essentially shows you what the yield is. Each of those you plot on a different date. And you can see there's lots of variability in your yield depending on the type of year and also when you plant. And this is shown on the left for one type of maize and then a hybrid version on the right. So you can see the hybrid is giving us bigger yields overall. But what it's showing is there is some optimal yield based on planting date, but there's also a lot of variability in there as well. And it kind of implies that if you have some kind of forecast that's reliable, or perhaps the start of the growing season and seasonal rainfall, you can start to think about making decisions on what to plant, so what variety, and also when to plant as well, to give you a better chance of increasing your yield or reducing the probability of losses. So in technical terms, how do these systems work? So here's an example for floods, and this is the same figure that Koen showed in his introduction presentation. So we're bringing together a number of technologies here. So we're bringing together data, historic data, but also model simulations that can give us flood risk maps, essentially. So that's the risk component of the early warning system. But we also want to have real-time monitoring and forecasting as well. So down in the lower part, we are using things like data from satellites to give us monitoring of water, soil moisture, agriculture as well. and also models that we run operationally to give us updates of some of the variables that we cannot see very well from satellites or on-the-ground measurements. And so we combine those historic simulations and real-time monitoring with forecasts. So in the case of floods, this is out maybe 5 to 7 days. And those forecasts are coming from global weather models. So we downscale them, we push them through our hydrological models, and that gives us forecasts of things like inundation. So these are the key kind of variables we like to have in terms of early warning for floods. And this is done in a probabilistic way, in the sense that, similar to what was in the previous presentation, but on a longer time scale, we don't know exactly what's going to happen in the future. So we do this in an ensemble framework where we assign probabilities to inundation happening in different places. And that's true for all aspects of forecasting and early warning. And there's also an important verification and validation aspect of this. So we'd always like to understand whether our forecasts are reliable, they're skillful, and how robust they are. So every year is going to be different. So that skill and that reliability may change. We want to make sure that we're robust in our forecasts. So I'll give you a few examples here. So this is from Cyclone Idai. This was mentioned before by Kuhn and others. And so this is the region that was affected. So Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Malawi, mostly. So this was back in March of last year, on the back of some other large storms that came through that kind of prepped the area for the flooding as well. So the ground conditions were very wet anyway. And you can see on the right, this is the monitoring that we do from our modeling. And you can see the evolution of the flooding, the stream flow flooding, as we go through the middle part of March. On the left is our forecast. Okay, so this is, you can see that looping through as well. And if you can manage to look at both diagrams at the same time, you can actually see that they match up pretty well in terms of these large scale spatial patterns. We can also focus down onto a particular river and look at the forecast over time in terms of the stream flow. So this is for the Pungwe River, which is right down on the Mozambique coast, that got a large share of the flooding. When you look at the satellite images, you can see the large-scale flooding that was happening. And if I just reveal this picture behind, this is showing the black is our monitoring. So this is forced by observations. So is as good as we know without having actual stream flow observations. And the reds are our forecasts. So these are happening 13 days ahead, then 11, 9, 8, 7. And you can see that there is variable uncertainty across our forecasts as we move forward in time. But when we get to about 7 days, so this is a week ahead, we can see that we're actually making a pretty good forecast of what actually happened, or what we thought actually happened on this stretch of river where we had most of the flooding. So this is pretty encouraging in terms of giving populations and institutions a bit of forewarning about what the flooding impacts might be. Of course, we can see the cyclone coming across the Indian Ocean, but knowing exactly what those impacts might be with this kind of lead time is really, really important. Here's another example. This is on the drought side of things. This is a slightly older example from the large-scale drought that happened over the Horn of Africa in 2010, 2011. And I'm showing on the left an example of the various ways that we can look at drought conditions from a monitoring perspective. So this is not just about looking at the precipitation. We're also interested in the vegetation and the soil moisture, so the agricultural drought and the impacts on vegetation. And also the river flows as well, which are really important for water supply as well as irrigation. And we can see how we get different perspectives across these different variables, which are coming from essentially from satellites and sometimes on-the-ground observations in the case of stream flow. And we can see how this drought propagates through time. That's shown by the kind of grey shaded areas. And the spatial footprint of each of those is shown on the right there as well, showing that, looking at one variable is going to give you just one part of the picture, and it's essential to look at multiple variables to get the full picture and the impacts across different sectors as well. On the right is a just quick example showing some of the forecasts that were made in terms of soil moisture over the region and the area in drought. And you can see that there was a pretty reasonable forecast that was initialized in September 2010 at the start of the drought. Of course, there's some uncertainty, but the spread is quite tight, which is good. As we go through to a forecast later in the next year, in February 2011, we see there's much more uncertainty there. So a lot more uncertainty coming from the climate forecast that then filters down into our assessments of soil moisture in this case. So we've been translating these approaches into operational systems. So here's just a couple of examples that we've developed in partnership with UNESCO IHP. And these are running in real time, just about real time, so maybe a day off real time. They're operational, so they're running every day. And they're providing this kind of information in terms of drought and flood, but also other elements of the water cycle as well. We have one example over the left. This is the Zimbabwean pilot monitor showing some drought conditions across the country earlier in 2020. Actually, the figure is showing late 2019, sorry. And then on the right, again, this is Cyclone Idai. So this is showing the runoff production that we're modeling as a result of the precipitation that was brought with the cyclone. You can see the huge widespread impacts there. And of course, we can relate that to the actual stream flow impacts and the flooding as well. So these systems are fairly new, but they're operational, so providing useful information. We're also making a lot of progress about bringing this down to the local level. So this is where the impacts are really felt. So we have new developments in, for example, flood risk mapping at the kind of tens of meters scale that's been enabled, not just by satellite remote sensing, but also having the computational capacity to run models and forecasts at these levels. So these two images are showing a couple of examples from satellite remote sensing down to the 30-meter space scale. So we're on the left, this is Bujumbura in Burundi, showing some historic risk of flooding in terms of the number of occurrences of flooding down to the street and block level. So this is really important for understanding the risks of various parts of cities and urban areas. On the right is a kind of a broader picture showing detection of inundation changes between January and when Cyclone Idai came through. So you can see the large changes, especially down to the bottom left, just to the outside of the Pungwe River there. And we're also doing this in a forecast mode. So not just monitoring, but also forecasting down to the level of about 30 meters. And this is just an example from the lower part of the Pungwe Basin, showing what happened from satellite imagery on the right, and then what we predicted a couple of days in advance. So of course it's not perfect, and this is just one example of one of the forecasts, but we can actually see a day or so in advance that we can pick up much of the detail of what actually happened. So I'll wrap up here. So in conclusion, early warning systems are an essential part of disaster risk reduction, providing that kind of forewarning. They can be applied to different and multiple hazards. So I showed for floods and droughts, but there are many other hazards that are related to climate and water variability. And there's a lot of potential for feeding this into alerts and decision-making and planning, as long as that other parts, those other components of the early warning system are also in place. It's possible to target these on local scale. So with some degree of reliability and skill, it depends on the hazard and also on the lead time. So basically how far in advance we can actually make these warnings. And there are operational systems, they do exist and they are being used, and there is a demand for this. So even if there are uncertainties and things to be done, there is certainly a demand for this information to be made available and used. And of course, there's always further work, and I hope within this museum scope to actually improve some of the work we're doing to make it more useful and make it more reliable and skillful and more relevant as well to the various stakeholders. So thanks very much. I'll stop that there.
Thank you very much, Justin. I think that gives an overview of what is possible currently indeed on the forecasting perspective, but also on the monitoring you mentioned. And I think the next speaker, specifically from VITO, the Flemish Institute for Technological Research in Flanders, will give us a perspective on what is currently possible in terms of monitoring, specifically of vegetation. And I would like to involve Roel van Holst to start his presentation, please. Go ahead, Roel.
Okay. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So basically, I hope you can, first of all, see my screen at this moment.
Yes, we can. Please go ahead.
So I'll just try to put the presentation in presenting mode. Kun, can you confirm that it's now in presenting mode?
Yes, we can see it full screen. Go ahead.
Okay, very good. So basically, our role in the PE Resilient project is to support the provision of satellite-based information, which can be used for agricultural monitoring. So at this moment, we haven't narrowed this down to one specific application, because also first we would like to understand a bit what are the needs within this project in order to respond with the Earth observation-based capabilities that we are working on at this moment, specifically for this project. So in the next 50 minutes, I also would like to inform you on some existing initiatives on Earth observation-based products and services for agriculture monitoring. And I hope also based on some example use cases that this can provide some inspiration for a further discussion of the role of phyto within this project. So I have three initiatives which I want to mention here: the Copernicus Global Land Service, FAO's WAPAR database over Africa, and then last also the high resolution crop monitoring services. So also this presentation was set up that it goes from the large scale monitoring at medium and lower resolution towards the field level for some very dedicated crop monitoring services. But let's start with the Copernicus Global Land Service. So these are basically free and public data available for large scale land monitoring. So Copernicus is a European Earth observation program, which is responsible for the operation of several satellites and also to process these data into a format which is easy digestible for the end user. Now, within these operational services, there are there are 6 different domains. And as phyto, we are coordinating the Copernicus Global Land Service, which is converting the satellite data into products which can be used for large-scale land monitoring. So let's dive into this. So here you can already see an overview of existing products within this Copernicus Global Land Service. So the resolution we speak about here is about 100 meters to 1 kilometer. And the time step at which you can expect this information is about every 10 days for most of the products. These products have been derived from the ProbaV satellite, which is a satellite which was developed by a Belgian consortium. But now this service is also moving towards the European Sentinel-3 satellites, which is providing continuity for the upcoming years. So basically, if you see what type of products are available, you see that there are 3 categories. So for vegetation monitoring, there are classical vegetation indices, which is saying something about the greenness or the photosynthetic activity within a pixel. Next to this, there are also products available on biomass production, also burnt area, information or indicators about the available soil moisture, and also land cover products. Then for energy, there are products which reflect the land surface temperature, top of canopy reflectance, and also albedo. And there is also one product which is indicating every 10 days where are water bodies detected spread over the globe. So a bit closer look to one of these products. So the land cover map is now an operational product, which is providing for each calendar year a global land cover map at 100 meter. So there are 10 main classes, and each class is further separated into some more detailed classes on land cover information available. And there are also cover fractions, which are not saying for each pixel the absolute land cover, but it's saying the percentage of each of this class within this pixel. So based on the application, also these kind of products can be fine-tuned. So in the meantime, there are data available since 2015, and they are updated each year also. Now, as the service is also going to shift from the 100 meter in the future towards the 10 meter, and first developments are already ongoing, supported by ESA, to come up with global land cover maps at 10 meter resolution. And if you can see the difference here between products which are available now at global scale, these are the images on the left. And then on the right, you can see the increase in spatial detail, which you can expect in the future for these kind of products. So I would like to mention here one example of an NGO who is using the Copernicus data for the monitoring of West African cattle herders. They have set up a system for West Africa that is using satellite-based information on biomass production as an indicator for where are the regions with most biomass available for the pastoralists. And also they use the Copernicus water bodies products to inform the cattle herders where most water bodies are available for their herds. So let's move a bit more in detail. So another database is the WAPOR database. This is a database which was set up by FAO, and Vito does the processing of a number of satellite products which are available in this database. So basically the objective here is to monitor the water use in agriculture. And this database is collecting information, satellite-based information on biomass, evapotranspiration, but also precipitation, and also information on land use and land cover is there. And by combining these type of information, assessments can be done on water productivity from landscape to field scale. And here you can see on the right an animation, for example, of satellite-based above ground biomass production for about 6 years in a row. So you see for these pivot irrigations, which fields were most productive in which year. Here you get a full overview of which products are available for the African continent and also for the Middle East. So at the continental level, the detail that you can expect here is about 250 meters. But there are some regions and countries in which this database is also providing data at a higher resolution, so at 100 meter level. And there are also some irrigation schemes or sub-basin levels where the data is also provided at 30 meter resolution. So an example usage of this WAPOR database. Here you can see the estimated crop water productivity for the Mada Basin in Kenya, specifically for maize. So what you see here, all these pixels are identified maize fields, and the color is indicating the satellite-based estimate of water productivity. So the blue ones are the ones that are least productive. The ratio biomass to water usage here is very low, while the the green pixels here are fields in which the ratio biomass to water production are the highest. This kind of information could be used, for example, to assess investments, also to identify yield gaps, but also, for example, to bring communities together. So let's say the farmers which are the champions in water productivity can talk with farmers which need to consume a lot more water for the same amount of biomass. So this is an example use of the WAPR database. Another use is irrigation mapping. So by combining a number of the layers, which I have shown before, it is also possible, if you know in the region where is the cropland, that you distinguish between the rain-fed croplands and the irrigated croplands based on the amount of water that was used by the crops and the amount of rainfall which was observed over a region. Okay, and third initiative is a project, Horizon 2020 project, which has just started, which is called Nextland. So here we dive into the high resolution crop monitoring services. So a number of products will be made available in this project, which all deal with high resolution monitoring services for agriculture, also for forestry. And the objective here is also to co-design the commercial service, so not staying until the level of the product, but really go towards an operational and commercial service with the end users active in the agriculture and forestry sector. So let's have a look at two of these midstream services, which then provide the basic information needed in order to roll out an actual service together with an end user. The first one is crop type classification. So this will be a service on using high resolution satellite imagery from Sentinel-1 and Sentinel-2. First of all, to delineate in a particular region where you can find the crop fields. And then secondly, also for each crop field, detecting which crop was grown there. So the result is then over a region that you have a crop map. As you can see here, this is an example over Belgium for 2019. And you can see different crops which were detected here. Then the second midstream service is a crop phenological cycle characterization. So this is also using high resolution time series of both Sentinel-2 and Sentinel-1. And what you can see here in this animation is on the left a greenness indicator, which was derived from high resolution satellites. And you can see how the dynamics throughout the year. This type of information can be then transformed by means of phenology detection methods towards having an idea for each field when the growing season has started. So this is a more generic application. We are also working on more dedicated crop phenology characterizations where we really want to detect the date of the harvest, for example. But this is often more dedicated towards one specific crop, and also often it's trained with some in situ data. So basically, that's the overview that I wanted to give here. So I hope it can provide some inspiration for further discussions in the project, and also to discuss more on the role of FITO within the project. I just wanted to thank you, and I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Roel. I think it was quite interesting and quite broad in terms of the types of information we can derive from remote sensing. And I think also you see a lot of let's say, new challenges and new opportunities arising. We actually had a question on that, and I will just hope if you could just hang on a bit more. I will just first give the floor to Adrian, and then maybe ask the question that was raised specifically to this topic, as it actually covers these 4 presentations. So I would just like to invite Dr. Adrian Tompkins. He's a research scientist in the Earth System Physics section of the ICTP, and senior visiting research fellow in the School of Mathematical, Physical and Computational Sciences at the University of Reading in the United Kingdom. So please, Adrian, guide us through new concepts of subseasonal to seasonal forecasting and also the potential for applications in Africa. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, so I'm actually working at ICTP, which is a Category 1 UNESCO institute, that was mentioned earlier. Before that, I was at also ECMWF, which is a big international operational forecasting center. And I've continued my interest at ICTP in the, should we say, the use and application of both seasonal and also sub-seasonal forecasts. So I was asked if I could give a kind of a very introductory overview of some of the activity that's been going on there. And I'm going to pick up on a couple of themes that have been mentioned in the last 2 talks as well, particularly the new Copernicus, should we say, endeavor. So I was wondering, actually, I was thinking about how to actually explain how we can actually get beyond weather forecasting and actually even think about, should we say, sub-seasonal and seasonal forecasting. So yesterday occurred to me, perhaps an analogy would be from Winnie the Pooh. So I don't know if probably most of you have heard of this game with poo sticks, where Winnie the Pooh would, with a friend, they would throw a stick off the side of a bridge and see whose stick came out on the other side first. So weather forecasting is a little bit like poo sticks. If you had a model of the flow of the water and of the weight of the stick and where it landed, the initial position, you could try and model and actually predict where the sticks would come out. But you'd find probably that, if you notice the illustration, the river's rather turbulent, and so maybe you would be successful in modeling the sticks' motion through the first 1 or 2 cycles and eddies, but very quickly, small differences in the initial position of the sticks would lead them to follow very different courses along the river, and it would be very difficult to predict after a while where the sticks should be. And so you have this kind of chaos basically overtaking your ability to predict. And so, but all is not lost. So when we actually want to do seasonal forecasting or even sub-seasonal forecasting, we're looking basically for situations a little bit like this. On the bottom, this is the Severn River back in the UK, and this is a tidal bore. So in this case, we've got a large scale wave traveling up the river. And so in these cases, we know the mathematics of wave propagation, and we can predict how this wave will move. So you can see that in some situations here, if we threw a stick on the front here, these sticks are actually surfboards, but you could throw a stick and you could perhaps predict how it would, should we say, move up the river carried by the wave. And so with seasonal forecasting, we're essentially looking for situations where both in the atmosphere and in the ocean, sometimes you have wave propagation that gives you enhanced predictability. So I'm going to mention 1 or 2 examples. Also, there are other slow-moving, should we say, evolving system components, such as, for example, in high latitudes, sea ice, land vegetation and soil moisture, as well as the subsurface ocean state that gives you predictability. And those also picked up on the talk 2 talks ago. Okay, let's change slide. So on this slide here on the x-axis, we have kind of the forecast lead time, which is how far into the future we want to basically predict, should we say, the weather or the statistics of the weather. Okay, so weather forecasts, maybe our chaotic motion is basically limiting us to really, if we're optimistic, on the order of 7 to 10 days. Okay, and it depends if you're in the tropics or the extratropics. And so basically, seasonal forecasts, which kind of started to come into being in the 1990s, aim to basically extend these forecasts, especially in the low latitudes, out to several months in advance, which is this purple line here. And then more recently, operational weather forecasting centers have basically identified this kind of gap between where the weather prediction kind of peters out and the seasonal forecasts. And so they've been introducing what we refer to as sub-seasonal forecasts, which are really looking at trying to predict, should we say, multi-day to weekly anomalies out to 1 or 2 months ahead. Now, in this list above here, you'll see that basically, obviously, the further out we want to predict into the future, the more computationally expensive it is. And so these longer term predictions tend to be run at lower resolutions. We'll see what that means at the moment. Now, as I just said, we're looking for wave propagation in the atmosphere. And so let's just focus on the seasonal forecast. Most of this enhanced ability to predict into the future basically relates to ENSO, okay, which I will talk about next. So this is the El Nino Southern Oscillation in the low latitudes. And I'll also mention the Madden-Julian Oscillation in a moment as well. So some of you may be familiar with these terms, of course. So ENSO, looking at this first for seasonal prediction, is essentially a wave in the ocean, an eastward propagating wave in the Pacific Ocean that basically means that warm waters that typically reside in the western part of the Pacific Ocean slosh in a wave-like motion towards the central and eastern Pacific. Okay, and in the tropics, of course, where it's warm, the air tends to go up, so you have enhanced convection and storm over the areas where you have warm anomalies, which means that other areas can have their rainfall suppressed. So on this map on the bottom is a very schematic depiction of this, where in ENSO conditions where we have warm waters, in El Nino conditions where we have warm waters in the central Pacific, you can see we tend to expect to have wetter than average conditions over the western Pacific through Indonesia, northern Australia, dry conditions. But the ramifications are felt all around the tropics and to a smaller extent in some of the extratropical regions as well. So we can see, for example, that in general, we expect through this particular phenomenon to have wetter than average conditions, should we say, in the Horn of Africa and drier in the southern Africa. Now, I'm not going to go into any detail, but there are other modes of variability in waves and oscillations that may give us predictability, such as the North Atlantic Oscillation, the quasi-biennial oscillation, the Indian Ocean Dipole. I'm not going to go into those, just to mention that we do have these other modes that on the whole are less well predicted and maybe have less of a large-scale impact. So ENSO is really the key one. So our models that we use to try and predict ENSO and its ramifications essentially divide the atmosphere up into, should we say, grid boxes or cubes, and we model then through the momentum equations the motions in these boxes, the temperature and the humidity in the atmosphere. But of course, if we want to actually predict this ENSO, should we say, anomaly in the Pacific Ocean, we also need to couple the atmosphere to an ocean model. So in order to get this enhanced predictability, we can't just use a model for the atmosphere that we can use just for short-term weather predictions for the next 2 to 3 days ahead. We need to have a coupled model that couples the atmosphere to the ocean. And note, if you want to take advantage of some of these other sources of enhanced predictability, you might also want to add other components to your weather forecast model, such as a dynamical sea ice model. You might want to represent at least some aspect of the seasonal cycle of vegetation, and also maybe incorporate a soil moisture model. And again, I'm not going to talk about these other components. Okay. How large are these grid cells? I mentioned resolution. What we mean by that is the size of these cells in the atmosphere. So the short-range weather forecast model at ECMWF, where I was working previously, uses box sizes of around 9 kilometers, which means any kind of, should we say, motions on smaller scales is not represented explicitly. Whereas seasonal forecasts now at that center are using 36 kilometers, and S2S uses a range of resolutions that lie between those two, should we say, extremes. Okay. These models, unfortunately, are not perfect. They have errors. So I'm trying to show this very schematically. So imagine we have some variable x could represent the temperature, and we want to know what the temperature is going to be sometime in the future. Okay, and so if this is an S2S forecast, this might be in 3 weeks' time, and this might be not necessarily at a single point in time, it might be a weekly average. Of course, the models have errors in the way they represent clouds and convection and precipitation processes, and the imperfect model means we're going to have an error in our forecast. We're not going to be able to predict the temperature or the rainfall exactly correctly, but also we're not going to know the initial condition exactly correctly. It's a little bit like when Winnie the Pooh throws his stick into the water. We don't know exactly where that stick is when it lands. We have an error in the initial, should we say, position and velocity of the stick. And that error can also then grow in time, as I said, due to the chaotic nature of the atmosphere. So how do we account for this? If you remember 2 talks ago, we talked about, and also the last probabilistic forecasts. Well, we basically have to conduct many, many forecasts. So we start off with basically perturbed initial conditions, and we run on the order at ECMWF 50 forecasts. It's actually 51 into the future. So all of these X's represent different forecasts. And so we might find that we have clusters of solutions that can maybe map out the probability of certain occurrences happening. Okay. Also, these models will have drifts. So as well as making a forecast for now, both the S2S and seasonal forecast systems also make forecasts for the past years, usually going back on the order of 20 years, depending on the operational center. And that enables us to actually then correct for drifts in the system. And they're also very useful, these databases, for assessing system skill. So if we go back to the example of ENSO on the left-hand side here, this is the very latest operational prediction of, should we say, the conditions in the Pacific. We're looking at the average in this map in the top right corner over this box shown here, marked Nino 3.4, which is kind of in the central-eastern Pacific. And these lines on this chart, the blue dotted line are what the temperature was doing in the past, and the red lines are showing forecasts for the future. So each line is an individual model run. And here we actually have 6 model centers, and each of those modeling centers run their model many times. So we have a very large ensemble, each of these lines representing a forecast. So what you can see, of course, is that uncertainty in the initial conditions, that uncertainty in the model physics leads to the different models, each ensemble member having a different trajectory into the future. And so if you remember, again, casting back to the 2 talks ago, we talked about probabilistic forecasts. What we mean is we can turn all of these forecasts into, for example, a probability. We can say, okay, what is the probability of actually having a positive anomaly? So in this case, this would be very weak or neutral to, in some cases here, we're getting up to a weak ENSO event, El Nino event. I keep saying ENSO, sorry. And on the lower end here, we can see a lot of the models are predicting La Nina conditions of a negative cold anomaly between -1 and -2. So we could assign a probability or look at a probability of a temperature range compared to, should we say, the long-term climate of what we expect the conditions to be. Okay. So interpreting these forecasts in a kind of probabilistic sense is both possible and desirable. We don't really want to just average all of these forecasts and say, okay, we expect this to happen and it's the average of these, because people might want to know what the chances are of, should we say, a more extreme, should we say, outlier in this distribution. Okay, so if you actually look at a map of the skill, you can see this area over the Pacific Ocean is where we have very high skill. This is actually looking at S2S systems forecasts, but we find that we have skill, should we say, throughout the tropics. And if we compare, the lower chart here shows the red and the blue lines are showing seasonal forecast skill, where 1 here is basically a perfect forecast and 0 is no skill at all. We can see that we're doing remarkably better than the dot dash line here, which is just basically taking the initial conditions and persisting them on. So if we start with El Nino conditions, then this forecast just says we expect it to continue. So these models do have skill ahead, okay? But this is, of course, concentrating on the sea surface temperatures here. Now, if you remember, we said those sea surface temperatures influence rain right throughout the tropics. And so it's important to see if the models can actually show those same kind of teleconnections. And this is one area where the models have really been improving. So if we look at the upper map, this is showing how, should we say, precipitation correlates with what's going on inside this box here in the Pacific. And on the lower end is basically the forecast model. And you can see that the general patterns are reasonably well produced. But looking and zooming in on Africa, you can see that this particular model here is not necessarily doing a very good job if you look at the whole year-round average of the Horn of Africa precipitation anomaly. And this is actually seasonal 5, system 5 from the ECMWF, so it's their latest state-of-the-art model. Okay. So these kind of maps, the point was made 2 talks ago again that one always has to look at, should we say, validating the forecast. These kind of are quite important to show in the past, looking at all of those different hindcasts, how your model's doing around the globe in the particular area that you're interested in. Now, all of these forecasts are now available basically in real time through, again, another Copernicus platform that's hosted at ECMWF. So they've launched this climate data store. And basically, I've given a link here. I don't have time to go into it. All of these systems are available in real time. So we have the Italian, the German, ECMWF system, the UK, the French, and one of the American models, and more are going to come soon. There's access through API, there's a web interface, you also have a toolbox to be able to do analysis directly through a web interface. And the database is really constructed to be sustainable long-term. It can be used operationally by agencies, governments, and NGOs, as well as by researchers. So it's designed to be robust. All of the variables are on the same grid. All of the same variables are available for all of the same models. It's very well documented. Okay. As well as seasonal forecasts, there's also reanalysis data as a supplement to observations, some limited amount of satellite observations, and also some climate model output, all through the same platform. So a lot of the time, actually, now that I run workshops, also in Africa, I spend a lot of time actually introducing this service because I think it's going to be one of the main portals through which climate information for should we say, gridded information for seasonal forecast and also possibly CMIP will be in the long-term future. S2S also has its portal. I've put a table here, so I've got a kind of a screaming face because I know you should never include tables in talks. But the reason why I've put this in is to emphasize that unlike the Copernicus platform, S2S is a research project. Okay, so the access to the S2S database is not necessarily guaranteed in the long term, and it's definitely what's called a database of opportunity. So all of the models are kind of contributed in a kind of as-found state. And so you'll find that they have different frequencies, they have different grids, they have different ways of operating their hindcasts. And so it's much less usable and most definitely a database more aimed at, should we say, research use. And it's also not available in real time, unfortunately. There's basically a 3-week block on the forecasts before they're released. So it's not useful for real-time access if you don't have access through one of the lead centers. Okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit about S2S as well before I wrap up. I mentioned earlier the Madden-Julian oscillation to kind of illustrate what this is for those that are not familiar. Again, it's a mode of variability which is operates on a much faster timescale than ENSO, and therefore gives us, should we say, enhanced predictability on that kind of 1 to 2 month timescale at which the S2S forecasts are operating. So imagine the MJO, the Madden-Julian oscillation, to be a kind of eastward propagating packet of rainfall. So it's an eastward moving, should we say, wave in the atmosphere. Enhanced precipitation that's propagating eastward. And the mode tends to move more slowly in the Indian and Pacific Oceans, and then moves more quickly, and it takes around 40 to 60
Okay, I see we have some technical challenges with we have some technical challenges at the point, so we give it 1 minute to see if we can reconnect. But maybe at the same time, while we wait and we'll see if we can reconnect, we had a question in the chat box I just wanted to highlight, which maybe can be used this time to answer that. So one of the colleagues asked if the remote sensing and GIS information is currently not used in Zambia for crop forecasting. So the question is if Zambia could be benefiting from getting accurate information on crop yield and getting information on type of crop planted as compared to physical forecast, which can be quite expensive. So that's a question I would like to ask to Roel. So what is the potential for bringing some of those products to the countries in the region?
So basically there are already available a number of Earth observation based products. Now, these products, however, are not, these products are mostly useful for crop monitoring. And if you want to go towards yield estimations, also a lot of in situ data is available and needs to be made available. And also yield models have to be set up. So it would require quite a lot of development work in order to really come up with yield models. It also depends on the scale in which you want these models. At regional scale, you could, for example, use official statistics in order to find empirical links with the available Earth observation data. And in this way, you could more easily come up with a model that can estimate yields over larger regions. But if you want to go in more detail towards the crop level, then also development work is needed. More development work is needed in order to develop such kind of yield models.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Roel. I think that helps to understand what are the challenges still to make those products operational. But I think it is indeed the intention to pilot some of those products in the Biosphere Reserves to test them on some of the crop productivity issues. So we'll also keep that conversation at a later point. The second question was actually quite relevant in terms of the current speaker. So I think we'll have to wait for him to be able to reconnect for that to happen. So I would just, in terms of keeping time, move on to the next speaker so that we can also quickly go towards the questions and answer session. I see there's quite a lot of questions being added. So I think it's important we keep time so we can also have time to answer all the questions that you have. So I would like to invite the next speaker, which is the last one of this session on disaster risk reduction, and which specifically looks at landslide detection and monitoring. Dr. Matthias van Marke is an associate professor at the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences at the University of Leuven, as well as the Department of Geography at the University of Liège in Belgium. So please, Matthias, go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you. So let me share my screen. Okay, so this works hopefully?
Yes, we can see it.
So thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity also. What I would like to do is present a bit of our research, not just mine, but from a lot of colleagues at KU Leuven and elsewhere, on assessing landslide risks in Africa. Not to give a comprehensive overview, but mainly to explore and hopefully discuss some opportunities on how we can address this challenge better in Southern Africa within the context of this project, of course. So basically, landslides are just, as we call it, the downward movement of soil or rocks or hill slope material as a result of gravity. So the idea is quite simple, but it remains a very poorly understood problem. Such landslides can vary in size, for example, from just a few cubic meters to several tens of millions cubic meters. Some landslides move rather slow, once every year with a few centimeters. But what we know best, of course, are these catastrophic landslides, which often happen in a few seconds and which can have devastating consequences. A main problem with landslides from a scientific point of view is that they are what we call highly threshold dependent. They are usually triggered by a very specific event, which can be an earthquake, especially in Asia, but often also long and or intensive rainfall events, which leads to building up soil moisture, which can result in a landslide or a mudslide. And as we know, such events can be highly catastrophic and often claim casualties. But even already at that point, our current understanding remains rather limited. This is, for example, a map from colleagues in the UK who try to register all reported cases of deadly landslides to come up with an estimate, and they estimate that around 4,000 to 5,000 people die because of landslides every year in, let's say, the past decade. However, this is most likely a severe underestimation because it's just based on what is officially reported. And if we look, for example, to another earlier study looking at this problem in the previous century per continent, you notice, for example, that in Africa, almost no landslide victims appear to or seem to have occurred. And of course, this is not at all the case. This is just a matter of reporting. Now we start to address this problem already better, but it remains a huge bottleneck, for example. Apart from these direct casualties and damages to infrastructure, landslides also lead to important indirect consequences. For example, they may end up in a river system, increasing the sediment load, affecting water quality, but also leading to downstream problems like reservoir sedimentation. But they can also start this way in interacting with other hazards, for example, floods and flash floods. Some landslides are triggered by floods, some landslides trigger floods themselves, and some happen just at the same moment because they're both the result of a heavy rainfall event in a sensitive environment. So trying to disentangle and understand these interactions is a critical difficulty. There are also many societal and economic impacts which remain poorly understood. For example, this is a study by colleagues in the Ruwenzori Mountains that try to really quantify the implications of landslides for farmers and livelihoods. And what they notice is that regardless of damage to houses and personal dramas, plots that are affected by landslides also lead to significant decreases in crop yield. On average, for example, a farmer earns 20% less income after a landslide event after consecutive years, so multiple years after that event. So this can directly drive farmers into poverty in some situations, but there are also indirect costs and impacts. For example, farmers with a plot that is really susceptible to landsliding typically have much less opportunities to expand their land and increase their income over a period of, say, 30 years, often because they are forced, for example, to adapt risk avoidance strategies and trying to optimize their yields and their income. So as such, there are many interactions with the socioeconomic sphere that are directly governed by this environmental process of landsliding, which is of course also sensitive to climate and land use changes. So it's a rather complex problem, but luckily we, not just our team, but in general, we have started to develop strategies in trying to increase our preparedness to deal with this hazard and increase our resilience. And overall, there exists this idea of a kind of roadmap where in fact we try to increase our understanding and our ability to predict this type of hazards in different steps. And usually the first step is landslide susceptibility assessment. Susceptibility assessment is mainly trying to answer the question, what exactly are the landslide prone areas? Where can we expect this and why? Which factors from an environmental perspective control this spatial occurrence? A next step is trying to answer the landslide hazard questions. More specifically, what exactly is going to trigger a landslide, be it an earthquake or a rainfall event? How big has such an event has to be? And then, of course, once you know that, how frequently can we expect such a landslide? And then, of course, there's a strong coupling to some of the previous presentations we have just seen. If you can then also predict or monitor rainfall, this can provide you with tools to say where and when a landslide is likely to happen. A final or third step is what we call landslide risks. And that is trying to assess which elements are exactly at risk during a landslide, if a landslide occurs on a given moment and at a given place. So to know that, you need to know exactly who is vulnerable, what elements are vulnerable in your landscape, but also how vulnerable are they from a socioeconomic perspective. Secondly, of course, you also need to try to predict and understand how large are these landslides that are likely to occur going to be. So addressing all these steps is basically necessary to come up with risk reduction strategies. These can include early warning systems, the proposals of societal and governmental measures that better protect people against such hazards, but also, for example, better land use planning and land management. If you know where landslides are likely to occur, this can guide your land use decisions in a very useful way. And especially in a context of climate change, I believe this is probably the best tool we have in often avoid catastrophes of this kind. But the bottom line remains that for all of this, we need, of course, a good process-based understanding of the factors controlling landslide risks. And this is easier said than done because, as I said, landslides are highly depending on specific triggers, which makes them highly stochastic events. They may or may not occur. So if you really want to understand what drives landsliding and how likely they are going to occur, you need large statistical data sets or large data sets that allow statistical analysis, for example, to identify thresholds of rainfall that may or may not trigger a landslide. So luckily over the past years, our understanding and ability to predict landsliding has significantly increased. And what I just want to do here is give a few examples of what can be done at this moment. For example, with colleagues, we developed a database of over 18,000 landslides across Africa using simple tools like mapping in Google Earth, but also integrating earlier inventories that have been constructed for specific regions. So these are the red triangles on the map, where landslides have already been mapped across Africa in targeted areas. Using all these data, we could construct, for example, the first data-driven landslide susceptibility map of the African continent, basically indicating which areas, which regions are really landslide prone and which aren't. We independently validated this map, and results confirmed that this map was rather robust to, at least at a regional scale, identify the major risk zones, and this already can be used as a tool to guide policy and further science, for example. Nonetheless, there remains quite a lot of room for improvement, as always. But for example, one issue is that some regions remain clearly underrepresented in the calibration of this model. And this mainly depends on how many landslides could be mapped or were found in this area. This, and given the size of the continent, this often remains problematic. Just to give one example, Zimbabwe, in our database, only 7 landslides are currently included. Evidently, there are many, many, many more landslides in Zimbabwe, but so far this issue remains, or these remain largely unmapped. This does not mean that the map for Zimbabwe is unreliable in this case, but it will often be less accurate. And this is indicated here on this picture. It basically shows the uncertainty on our predictions. Red means that the map is, or that our model is less certain. And the best way to improve this, and also to increase the spatial resolution, for example, is to map more landslides, go in the field and complete these kind of inventories to allow for a more robust and accurate landslide susceptibility assessment. The next step, as I said, is landslide hazards. Given that most of the landslides in Africa, and especially Southern Africa, are triggered by the rainfall, there exists a lot of opportunity to link basically, for example, satellite rainfall products to simple models that try to assess the risk of having, or the probability of having a landslide in a given area. And there has been some important conceptual improvements over the past years. As this graph shows, for example, it may look a little bit complicated, but basically it plots for every dot, which represents a known landslide with a known date, what was the antecedent rainfall, which gives a proxy of the rainfall over the past day, but with a decay function to account for the fact that soils become drier again, in combination with this landslide susceptibility, which we could assess with the previous model. And as you can see, this allows you to basically fit a lower curve. In these cases, the probability or the 5 or 10% exceedance probability curves. So basically it means that if you are on a given day in a situation below this threshold, there's not really a landslide risk. If you are above these thresholds at a given location and based on previous rainfall records, landslide risk significantly increases. So basically this means that you can not only tell where, but also when landslides are likely to occur, at least from a conceptual point of view. The main problem also here is that constructing such threshold models requires a sufficient amount of data on known landslide events, so we can couple them back, for example, to the rainfall records of the days before. Furthermore, this remains a largely statistical tool, and many other aspects such as soil characteristics and land use can also play a huge role in affecting, for example, the antecedent rainfall, because in fact what does matter most is the soil moisture content. So also here, better assessing and modeling this remains a difficult but highly interesting challenge. Then with respect to the last step, landslide risk, as I already said, so it basically relies on the previous steps, knowing how frequent landslides are likely to occur and also especially where, as well as knowing what elements are really at risks, where are the villages, what is the respective position of, for example, villages with respect to potential landslide zones. So this exercise often becomes more complicated, also because you need to at least get some assessments of how large a landslide is likely going to be. But nonetheless, using, for example, field-based research, we can already construct, I think, useful tools that can assess landslide risks for a given area and which can greatly help in policy development. So this is an example we conducted in the Mount Elgon region in Uganda, where we went in the field and mapped all these dots which represent landslides. We tried to date them as well as possible. Based on this, we could increase or improve upon our landslide susceptibility map at a much higher resolution and having much better validation results. But we could also come up with simple landslide risk maps like this, which basically show in this case how many persons per year are likely exposed to a landslide at a given location. Sadly enough, just a few days before we published this study and this map, a fatal landslide in the area killed over 40 people as a result of a heavy rainfall event. This event happened here, so it provides a very sad validation of our map, but I believe it also demonstrates the use of products like this, which, although they remain rather simple from a scientific point of view, such tools can really help in avoiding these impacts and guiding towards a better management of this problem. And I believe that, as has already been said, thinking locally towards global solutions is a key element. I believe that similar research strategies can and should be conducted in several landslide-prone areas in order to better assess landslide susceptibility, hazard and risks, but also build up towards a better and higher disaster risk preparedness, as well as in order to identify sustainable land management strategies. As I said before, managing your land, your hill slopes in the correct way can make a huge difference in this regard. And as this map, which was already shown by Koen, demonstrates, many of the biosphere reserves here also in fact fall within highly landslide susceptible zones. So I think this not only creates a challenge, but also an important opportunity to better address this problem, which is in fact not just only relevant for Southern Africa, but for the whole world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthias, for that very interesting talk, and also to show the link between the biosphere reserves and the landslide hazards and risks as well. So I think we just want to give a few more minutes to Adrian, who unfortunately dropped off because of internet challenges at home. And maybe if I could ask him to wrap up the talk, because we're of course already a bit over time, but also maybe at the same time answer one of the questions that was asked in the chat box, which is about the Rift Valley system, specifically in Southern Africa, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Malawi, and if indeed there is a potential for supporting, let's say, climate-informed decision-making in that area using some of those tools that you mentioned, just to maybe make the link between the questions and the presentations as well. Go ahead, Adrian, to finish your conversation.
Okay, I'm really sorry about that. Our internet dropped off for, let me go back into the share screen then. Okay, what I will do is I will just wrap up super quick. I'm going to skip over a couple of slides, but they're available afterwards. Let's see, share. So I will move over, should we say, let me move this and go into full screen. So I just to wrap up that issue about the MJO, I was showing this eastward propagating mode that affected the weather throughout the tropics. And this is just an assessment of the different models that contribute to the S2S project from different operational centers around the world, and showing again that on this y-axis, it's how far in advance they can reliably predict this mode. And basically, the best models now are reaching up to 30 days ahead in terms of their skill at predicting this mode. I'm going to skip over then, in the interest of time, some of these assessments of the rainfall and just show basically two examples. One was basically the actually this one here was the predictability of, should we say, the monsoon onsets. And this is an example of a recent analysis that was published just over 2 years ago of the West African monsoon onset and the Indian monsoon onset, comparing the models again in the S2S database, a subset of models, to the predictions using climatology, and showing how the highly variable West African monsoon onset at a grid point level, the models again up to about a month ahead give you some information about the onset dates. But again, with quite a lot of error on this y-axis, you can see that even at very short timescales, the root mean squared error is on the order of 10 days. The other thing I quickly wanted to say, I don't have much time to go into the details, was just to say as well that when we look at these skill metrics, things such as anomaly correlations, often they don't relate too directly to, should we say, the decision entry points. So the other talks this afternoon have looked at specific, should we say, applications of climate models. In the meteorological world, a lot of the assessments that we use to discuss forecast skill don't relate directly to, should we say, how people might want to use the forecasts on the local scale. And it really depends on the decision entry point. What is the frequency of the event that one's trying to actually look at? What is the cost if you actually suffer an unprepared for event? And what's the cost of mitigation? So just very quickly to give an example where one application of these seasonal forecasts that we actually made at ICTP, where we were looking at malaria forecasting, in this case in Uganda, then we actually tried to look at the forecast in a kind of an economic analysis framework of a kind of a cost loss, where on the y-axis here you look at the frequency of an event. So the further up you go, the rarer the event it is, so the more extreme the event. And on the x-axis here, you have a kind of a ratio between the cost of intervention compared to the loss of not preparing. So this framework can be used for all sorts of, should we say, applications, whether it's farming, whether it's flood work. In this case, we're trying to apply it to health. And so in this case, you can really look at the forecast in terms of where they might have value, where on the bottom left here, where you have frequent events and your intervention is very cheap, even if your forecasts are highly skillful, the occasional mistake that they make still might actually mean that it's actually better just to simply always intervene, because it's cheap and the event you're trying to protect against happens quite frequently. Likewise, on the top right side here, you have a zone where the forecasts are not very useful because it's an extremely rare event and perhaps your cost of intervention is very expensive. And so you have this kind of band of, should we say, regions of frequency and, should we say, cost of intervention, where the forecast is shown to have, should we say, value for this particular site in Uganda, Kanungo. So I'm going to wrap up there. I'm sorry to kind of jump over the detail of some of these applications. So what I wanted to show, I'm going to skip over this as well, which is talking again about the interface to decision making, and kind of just go to this kind of summary. Just to emphasize that this Copernicus platform is available, should we say, offering forecasts globally. So you might have to repeat the question. I think the understanding was if it could be applied to areas, I think you mentioned Zimbabwe. Sorry, I was putting the talk up, so you might have to repeat just to clarify the question. But essentially, the information is available globally. Obviously, at the grid resolution of, should we say, the archive, which for the seasonal forecast is 1 degree, for the reanalysis is 30 kilometers. Where it's useful really depends on your area. So in Africa, the Southern African region and the Eastern African region, where you have the strongest teleconnections, for example, with ENSO is where, for example, there's the most potential to actually use the forecasts on a seasonal timescale. Through the tropical band, which is influenced by the MGOs, where you also have some enhanced predictability on shorter timescales. So I'm going to stop there and again apologize for the gap in my presentation. Yes, I don't know if you want to repeat the question. Did I?
Right, so it is indeed about the specific area of the Rift Valley, and that has quite a unique climate. And the question is indeed if climate scientists could focus on this unique ecosystem. So what is kind of the skill and opportunity to work in those areas with these kind of new systems and information?
Right. So, I mean, basically, there isn't an area that has, on these timescales, there is, should we say, quite a strong teleconnection. So in terms of predictability of anomalies, there is some scale there. Nevertheless, these models have biases and drifts, okay, which need to be accounted for, which is why it's so important to use should we say, the entire hindcast series in order to be able to look at the performance of the model in that area and how to be able to correct for those biases. So when we apply it for the malaria predictions, for example, we need to correct for errors in the temperature and the precipitation before we apply that information to the dynamical malaria model to make the malaria predictions. Otherwise, the predictions are just completely off. So the potential is there.
All right, thank you very much. I think that was a good answer. And actually, we can actually explore a bit more in the question and answer session where we can give the floor to the participants. We just want to wrap up the last presentation to be able to go to the questions and answer session specifically if there would any be. So let's just go to the last speaker, which is more about citizen science for improved monitoring and really making the link with local communities. And Dr. Wouter Buitaert is a professor at the Imperial College of London and also a fellow of the Grantham Institute for Climate Change. Wouter, your time.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very kind introduction. Let me just share my screen. Okay, just checking. You can see my screen?
Yes, it's working. Go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me to this very exciting event and start a very exciting project. I will use the next 10-15 minutes to tackle quite a different topic from the previous presentations, in the sense that I would try to address two particular aspects. One is data collection in the field. I guess we all know that a region like Southern Africa is still very sparsely monitored, and despite all the novel applications of remote sensing and satellite imagery, there is still a need to go on the ground and make on-the-ground measurements for many different variables. So that is a big challenge, creating the data that feed into the advanced models that we've seen, measuring, quantifying the variables like river flow, flood risk, etc., that are necessary to create the evidence base to manage them. So that is one aspect. The second aspect, as the title of this session highlights, is education, or I would actually want to broaden that up to finding ways to make decision-making as well as evidence generation more inclusive. Essentially, how can we make sure that all the necessary, the required stakeholders are involved in the entire process of generating evidence, interpreting it, and using it to make sound decisions about climate change adaptation. And on the interface between those sits this relatively new phenomenon of citizen science, which basically combines both and in particular tries to leverage new technologies as a way to open up the whole realm of data collection and try and make that as participatory as possible. So citizen science, to start off with a definition, it essentially refers to the participation of the general public, or even more broadly, non-scientists in the generation of new scientific knowledge. And this really is an activity which has been ongoing for a very long time, but over the last decades has really grown quite a lot, especially because of the advent of new technologies for both data collection, new sensors, particularly affordable, low-cost sensing technologies, but of course the much broader aspect of ICT. Think about mobile phones, the internet, and the ability to really exchange information and data in real time through different actors. So it is an activity which has really gained in importance and in interest as a way to alleviate those issues with data scarcity, and at the same time an opportunity to bring in new actors in the whole process of data collection, but also the the interpretation of the data and integrating it in the practice of making decisions. And probably if we think about citizen science, the aspect that springs to mind most directly is including citizens in direct observations. Measurements, either manual observations or these days using, for instance, mobile phone apps to make observations, put them into an app which allows transmission to a centralized database, and in that way really engaging citizens as a way to increase manpower, if you will, and make more observations than a single scientist or an operational practitioner is able to do. And that kind of measurements has become very popular in different fields. Think about biology, the observation of species, birds are very popular, but also GIS and geography, the observation or tracing locations, parts, etc. Or indeed, even in hydrology, which is an discipline where it's slightly less evident to make direct observations through making photos, for instance, of rivers, and some clever algorithms, you can measure things like water level and stream flow. And here an example of the groundwater project implemented by the University of Zurich, which has been very successful in developing very advanced algorithms that allow citizens to measure river level. As you can see here on the bottom right, basically they use augmented reality to overlay a virtual staff gauge over a photograph, and as such allow people to make measurements about water level, which are later on interpreted and converted into stream flow. So this is an area which, enabled by new technologies, has really gained importance and provides great opportunities for direct measurements of very many different environmental variables. But at the same time, obviously, technology also pervades into sensing methods as well. And also in terms of more automatic sensing, there are many new different technologies that can be used to basically build low-cost, affordable, robust sensors for automatic sensing. And I'm sure that many of you are familiar with technologies like, for instance, Arduino, which is often pitched as an open source hardware platform, which allows hobbyists to build their own loggers, connect low-cost sensors, for instance, on the left-hand side, sensors to measure water level, essentially distance sensors, which allows you to build a low-cost solution for automatic monitoring. And that obviously also opens up perspectives for people that are not professional scientists or technologists to build, implement, and be involved in the whole process of measuring automatic variables like water level, rainfall. Automatic weather stations, for instance, are a very popular application of those low-cost sensing and logging technologies. And also here, the advent of mobile phone signals, etc., makes it much easier and cheaper to also transmit data, implement telemetry, and reaching relatively remote areas in ways that was not possible 10 or 20 years ago. So a lot of great opportunities here. But let's try and extend the approach to just beyond simply the data collection. Obviously, data collection is a very important aspect of generating evidence, but of course we want to do something with the raw data as they come from a weather station, as they come from a flow gauging station. And so also in the aspect of data processing and knowledge extraction, citizen science and participatory methods more in general can play a very important role. And here is an example of work we do with an NGO called Practical Action in Nepal, for instance, which is a region which is very prone to environmental hazards, landslides, flooding, also at the foot of the Himalaya mountains, and where you can use new technologies, for instance, participatory mapping, participatory modeling, to map flood risk and susceptibility, vulnerability of local populations, who lives where, etc., in a way that is much more effective and much more participatory than, if you will, classic methods that were used before. So there's another aspect where obviously new technologies, and particularly mobile phones, can really play a very, very important role to extend and support citizen science activities. And lastly, if we talk about developing and generating new evidence, a last aspect that is of paramount importance is visualization, communication of the generated knowledge. And of course, also there, the broader, the more inclusive we want to make that process, the more important it is to make sure that information is communicated in a way that is appropriate for a non-scientist or a non-expert to assimilate, to understand, and to learn from that knowledge. And obviously that requires specific ways of visualizing and designing potentially very complex pieces of information. Think about maps, think about time series, three-dimensional, four-dimensional patterns, etc. So thinking about how to do that to make sure that different types of audiences can understand that is very important and often still a main challenge. And ideally, we don't want that to be a one-way flow of information towards an end user. We want that to be an interactive process, and also here interactive ways of visualization combined with things like social media provide a great opportunity to make that a multilateral and a multidimensional and directional way of flow of information, not just from the expert to the end user, but also a way to integrate local views, local expert knowledge in the process of knowledge generation. So to wrap that up, the way that we as scientists think a bit about that is trying to make the whole workflow, if you will, the whole process of knowledge generation as interactive and participative as possible, and aimed towards what we then call the co-creation of locally relevant and locally actionable knowledge. Combining those different steps of observing, collecting raw data, which especially for natural science processes, environmental processes, is still extremely important, but also processing, interrogating that data and disseminating it, and at the same time using that as a way to interact between different stakeholders, to understand, to think about what can we do with that information, but also to identify new knowledge gaps, what are the next steps, and basically informing, again, that iterative process of collecting further data and using that to accumulate that evidence base that is required to support decision making. And that has a lot of analogies with another type of theoretical framework developed by Miguel from UCL here in London, who calls that extreme citizen science, a citizen science where the citizens are really involved in every single aspect of the knowledge generation process, including defining, identifying the key elements, the necessities, the priorities of the evidence base that is needed to support local decisions about environmental management and climate change adaptation in particular. So that is the theory, and I just want to illustrate that with an example of what you can call a participatory citizen science type of project to alleviate extreme data scarcity in a different place of the world, being South America, but which in a way has a lot of similarities with the context of which we're talking about today, which is Southern Africa. And more particularly, the Andes in South America is, as of course you know, a large mountain region which is exposed to very similar environmental issues and natural hazards like landslides, flooding, droughts, and is very vulnerable to future climate change and faced with that acute scarcity of environmental information. And so there we set up a participatory monitoring network with local communities to measure hydrology and environmental processes like rainfall, temperature, air temperature, etc., to create more information that allows local people and managers to make better decisions about, in this particular case, water resources management and how to adapt to future changes, decreasing precipitation, melting glaciers, and other pressures and threats which are induced by climate change. So we work with local communities, each of which has very specific questions, some of which are exemplified here, about how they need to manage their local environment to make themselves more resilient to those pressures and threats which I just mentioned. And so that highlights the very localized nature of those questions and the importance of involving local people in identifying those questions and thinking about what is the kind of evidence that is needed to address them. But in a way, they all have underlying similarities in terms of the type of data that need to be collected in order to address some of those challenges, particularly fundamental physical fluxes like stream flow, precipitation, and environmental and hydrometeorological processes. So there's a lot of opportunity to create, if you will, a community of practice and to exchange and to pool resources to come up with local solutions for monitoring. And that is what we did with those communities, setting up hydrometeorological monitoring to create a sufficient evidence base which can be analyzed to look at signals of, for instance, the impact of different types of land management on stream flow, water availability, drought risk, etc. And I won't go into detail on this slide, but just an example of the kind of regional analysis that is possible if you pool the data from those different sites, bring them together and analyze them with state-of-the-art hydrological models. And so also here, technology plays a fundamental role, and one aspect we've focused on a lot is to develop robust sensors which can be used, like in this example, to measure the response of mountain wetlands to climate change, given the importance of those wetlands as a water resource for local communities. And these are very remote locations, so you want to have technology that is robust enough, at the same time low cost, such that it's affordable for local NGOs and actors to ensure that you can measure, in this case, water level and geohydrological processes of those wetlands. And so one example of a technology that we've developed in that particular context of the participatory monitoring in the Andes. And an example related to visualization is a study that we did within the context of that participatory monitoring to quantify and characterize ancestral local practices for water security. And in this case, a system that is called locally Mamanteo, which is essentially an artificial recharge strategy where water is taken from a stream, dumped onto a hill slope, allowed to infiltrate, and as such delays the hydrological response and increases water availability during the dry season. And so that is a system that locally exists, that people have developed and obviously used because they know that it works, but which was really never quantified from a more formal hydrological perspective. And so the participatory monitoring allowed us to quantify that and put and integrate this practice in a much broader context of water resources management and climate change adaptation. In this particular case, for the city of Lima, which is the capital of the country of Peru. And what you see here is basically a way to visualize how the entire broader database that is required to make predictions and build the evidence to make sound decisions, and at the same time try and make that whole process more participatory, more inclusive. So I hope that that was interesting, and obviously I'd be more than happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wouter, for that very interesting talk. And it, of course, shows how communities can be engaged in monitoring and also play a role in understanding their environment. So I think this is also something that is quite relevant for the Biosphere Reserves and could be a model that could be also used in this project, which, of course, is up to discussion. I think we're at this point a bit beyond time, but I think we can still make time enough for questions and answers. Before we discuss the way forward and how we would like to move ahead in the project implementation and to collaborate with all of you. So we have actually now the time to take your questions. So we will give you the floor when you raise your hand, or if you have a specific question, you can also type it. But I would say in this session, you can just raise the hand and then we'll allow you to speak. So I think at this point we have one hand raised, so I will allow the person. Right, this one, just one. So it should be possible to allow David Mulera to speak. Can the? All right, so David, you're able to speak and ask your question directly. You have to unmute your microphone.
Can you unmute? Can you unmute?
So David, if you have a question, this is the time to ask it. You have to unmute your microphone.
I'm not sure it's actually.
Okay, if not, I will go to the next person and we can always try later. So Mark, please, we'll give you the floor. You should be able to unmute your microphone and you can speak.
There we go. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Okay, great. I think what's come through very much on this whole lot, we work on the ground very much at Biosphere Reserves. And I think the ground proofing of scientific evidence on the ground is something that biospheres could be used on a lot more regular basis. You know, we live in the area, we see for landslides, for instance, and everybody relates it to water, but we also know that if we get a fire in the region and we don't get fire comes through the Fynbos area, for instance, 6 weeks before we get heavy rain, we know there's going to be landslide. So there's a lot of other elements that I think on a practical basis, ground level information, we should be able to feed back to the scientists on a level that possibly somebody trying to do remote sensing doesn't pick up. And I think that's a very important thing to take into cognizance. It's people living and working in biospheres see this information on a day-to-day basis every day. And remote sensing, yes, very good, but we think we can definitely give a lot of information. So we need to set up a mechanism where people living in the area that know we had a fire in Fynbos 6 weeks ago, and we know if it's gentle rain, the vegetation will grow, but if we know there's a heavy rain, there's going to be landslide. So there's a lot of baseline with communities and people that farm. Based on information, we need to be able to feed back to the scientific world, the academic world. And that's where I think biospheres can play a major role.
Thank you, Mark. And Mark Gijzen is the manager of the Cape Winelands Biosphere Reserve in Western Cape. So thanks for that. And I agree. I think that's also a bit of the objective of starting to link up the Biosphere Reserves as observatories, as I mentioned, or as laboratories, natural laboratories. So in this sense, where actually some of these, let's say, information can be feedback in both directions. It can't be a one-directional discussion. It has to be a dialogue. And actually to make sure that some of these products that are available are actually become useful at the local level. And we feel that Biosphere Reserve can actually play a role in making that happen. So thanks for that comment. I'm not sure if you want to elaborate. If not, I will just give the floor to one of the panelists to answer that. And I will keep it open to everybody, but I think this one is specifically mentioning landslides. So Matthias, if you want to take this one.
So, sorry, yes, I missed the question, I think.
Yeah, it's about basically the feedback of Biosphere Reserves playing a role in providing local data sets for validation, but also let's say be partnering with the scientific world to exchange information, to make sure that the information that can come out of the scientific work is actually useful at local level.
Yes, yes. Well, indeed, I think, at least from a landslide perspective, this is indeed crucial. We can do some things with remote sensing, but in fact, the best way to really come up with useful tools and models is go in the field and map these landslides in collaboration also with local population. And then I think also there is a very strong link with the whole idea of citizen science. Basically, when we talk about landslide hazards, as I said, what you need to basically know to construct such models is where a landslide happened and also when. So in the case of Uganda, for example, this really meant going in the fields and discussing with farmers, because they, of course, they will remember when a certain landslide event happened, date. And this seems rather basic information, but it's absolutely crucial to develop these kind of tools. So yeah, I agree with the philosophy of the project here and with what Mark was proposing.
All right, thanks for that. I have another question on citizen science from Kinedik from Botswana. On citizen science, you spoke about the quantification of the traditional methods that were used in water monitoring. Can you expand on that one?
I guess that's a question for me.
Yes, it is.
Yes, so that particular case relates to the fact that in the formal water management processes implemented by national institutes, etc., often, and I won't say always, but often struggle with integrating local practices in the bigger water management plans at the level of a catchment or even a country. Because obviously they use scientific tools, etc., models, and the classic science, if you will, but the more local practices are often not sufficiently characterized from a formal scientific perspective to, for instance, integrate in a model, integrate in a quantitative simulation about water availability and calculations, etc. Or at least that was the case with this particular local practice. And so the formal engineers from the Peruvian Water Management Office were a bit reluctant to say, yeah, that might work on a local level, but we're not entirely sure. We prefer our standard dam and grey infrastructure, if you will. And so by characterizing those and creating that quantitative information, that is basically allows them to bridge and to really integrate those local practices better in the more formal quantitative assessments and predictions, which are the typical tools for water resources management. And so that was a way, essentially we leveraged citizen science and participatory monitoring as a way to create that scientific evidence base that allows those local solutions to be more formally integrated in water management plans and adaptation strategies.
Thank you very much, Wouter, for that. I hope it answered the question, but I think it did. I have two more questions. I will join them together here. Is the project document accessible on the UNESCO website? If so, kindly share the link. I think it is, but in any case, we will have all the information in the project document also on the website. Unfortunately, we couldn't fully establish the website before the meeting, but it will be ready by next week. So you will have all the information that is in the project document also there. And it will also be, of course, a live site where basically all activities, initiatives will be mentioned and will be tracked. So also the information of this webinar will be available and accessible from there, including the presentation. So we can also share the link, and of course you have it also in your documentation. One question was on funding, and is what is the channel for disbursing funds into the Biosphere Reserves? So as I mentioned, this is a process, and I think we can just after this question and answers just briefly touch on the next steps. And ideally, we would like to have conversations with the Biosphere Reserves and other stakeholders to see how we move from here and what are the first activities we can do, considering also we have challenges in terms of the current outbreak of COVID-19. which need to be addressed. So in this sense, we'll have to mitigate, but we have some solutions that we also would like to present just after this session. And I just reading directly this question, and I would like to nominate the Lake Sibai area in South Africa as a biosphere reserve. This would be linked to an FDM project in South Africa, whereby the largest freshwater lake in the country is diminishing through climate change, economic and social dependence factors. It depends, of course, the nomination of biosphere reserves is a formal procedure, and it actually involves the Department of Environment in the case of South Africa. So I would like to suggest to reach out to the relevant entities to support that nomination, so that actually that could be a potential opportunity going forward. But take note, of course, that this is a long process, which often takes up to a year for a nomination to be valid. Any more questions? If anybody wants to have additional questions or raise its hand, we can also give you the microphone so you can ask the question directly to the members of this team. So I'm just waiting for anybody who wants to add a question. This is the opportunity. We will, if no more questions arise, we will go to the last section. So if you have anything you would like to see clarity on, this is the moment to raise your hand so that we can give you the floor. Okay, we have the Waterberg Biosphere Reserve that raises the hand, so please give them the floor. You'll be able to unmute now your mic and to ask the question, please.
Hello, can I be heard?
Okay, we have first David. So David, I have you now, and then we will go to the Waterberg Biosphere Reserve. Go ahead, David.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry, I couldn't unmute the first time that I attempted. But my contribution is very brief. I'm very impressed with the beautiful presentations that have been made. And I was just wondering whether the tools that colleagues are using in predicting, for example, the floods, et cetera, could also be applied in predicting the impact of COVID in the targeted biosphere reserves. I'm asking this question because COVID is with us, and it's going to be with us for some time. So within the project, we should also consider factoring in this aspect. So I just wanted to get that clarification. Thank you.
Right, so indeed it is a climatologically driven forecast that we're looking at. And at this point, it's very difficult to make the link between COVID, let's say, outbreaks in certain locations and climate factors. It seems to be more driven by agent-based initiatives, basically people moving and bringing the infection with them. So it's a bit more difficult in terms of linking that to a climate factor. Of course, there are agent-based systems that look at specifically these potential spreads. The project isn't at this point targeting that kind of models, although they could be eventually be looked at specifically if there's a link with some applications such as health issues, where of course the agent-based applications are also relevant. I'm not sure if anybody of the team, and I know that some of the team members that spoke on forecast had to leave, but maybe if I can give this to Adrian, if he's still on the phone, then I would like to get his perspective, since he works on health-related issues as well.
Well, I would just reiterate what you said. I've been looking at quite a lot of the literature that's coming out on the COVID climate link, and as you say, a lot of the linkages are very tenuous. And I have to say, actually, it's been a bit of a bugbear of mine that a lot of the work has been of quite a low quality. It's been really rushed out, and a lot of the analysis you actually see on the, should we say, the preprints before it's going to review. When you actually dig into it, it's really not done very well at all. So I think we're a long way off from actually being able to use, should we say, the climate forecast to actually do any kind of reasonable prediction of COVID. As you say, at the moment, with a very large susceptible population, the other factors are anyway, I think, dominating. And you can see that even in the summer months in the US with the wave in the southern states. So I think you hit the nail exactly on the head with your comments there, actually.
All right, thank you very much. Okay, I hope we answered that question. So we have a question from Waterberg and then from Chimwemwe. So please unmute your microphone. Maybe we can help from here. Okay, if still some challenges, I know they're trying to, yeah. So we have Tembo, who is speaking now, and we'll try just later with Waterberg. Go ahead.
Okay, my question is on the issue of weather forecasting prediction.
Sure.
Here, where I come from, where I work, Lake Jura and Biosphere Reserve, we have a problem of lack of data collection gadgets, weather data collection gadgets, like rain gauges. So my question is, the project, will it also involve in purchasing these weather-related gadgets like rain gauges? That's my question.
Okay, that's a good question. I think it relates to some of the work we would like to do with citizen science, where we indeed would like to involve some measurement devices to test in communities inside Biosphere reserves. Because we feel that Biosphere reserves have a designated function, and one of them, of course, is also becoming observatories. And in this sense, it makes sense to also look into potential expansion of their monitoring capacities. In this sense, we could look at some of these more innovative tools that could be quite low cost, and maybe Wouter can give some examples of such cost, so that we can actually also absorb some of those costs in the project and equip some of the Biosphere reserves with better monitoring equipment. Wouter?
Yeah, I mean, it is very hard to put specific costs, but I can give you some examples. So for instance, the water level sensors, which we've used operationally in many countries, so we're quite sure that they are robust and fit for purpose, are about $200, including telemetry, but excluding the costs of actually sending the data, which depends on the location and the kind of plan for mobile phone connection. But yeah, for about $100 to $200, you can often build quite a robust logger system, and then add any sensors. And then, of course, it depends on the cost of the actual sensor to get the total cost. But for a full weather station, probably around somewhere between $500 and $1,000, you can have a good weather station. Obviously, not one that adheres to all the guidelines and recommendations of WMO, but one which often generates useful information for things like mapping intense precipitation, etc. So yeah, but I think that another advantage is really that using open source hardware, you can really design the most appropriate or the lowest cost solution that is adequate in a particular context, and that gives you a lot of flexibility to look for the best value for money.
Could I add a comment there as well, please?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, we also had a project. The last presentation, actually, I found really interesting. We also had a project that's just starting now in Ethiopia, looking at low-cost centres for weather stations, and the figures are very similar. In fact, to the ones you were just saying. I think it was on the order of $400 for the main station without wind. In fact, the wind sensors were the most expensive, almost doubles the cost, to around $800–900. But what I was really surprised about when they were passing me the specs is that some of these low-cost sensors now really are actually getting very close to the WMO specifications, at least for the temperature, the main, should we say, the measurements temperature, and also the precipitation. You're really not very far off, really, you know, a high quality, expensive WMO certified station. So it really is becoming quite affordable now. And I think one of the exciting things that allows us to do is that it really allows us to kind of drill down onto, should we say, variability on very small spatial scales. So for example, IRI have been looking at insurance schemes based on weather monitoring to pay out for, you say, poor, should we say, harvests. And one of the big question marks about that is that we really don't have a good handle on very small scale variability on precipitation. And I think these low cost solutions are really quite exciting because they will allow us to also set up experiments of looking at heterogeneity and microclimates on much smaller scales, which really we don't have a good handle on at all with the current network of in situ stations and also from, should we say, coarser scale satellite information. So I think it's quite exciting times now with this new technology.
Thank you very much. And I think that was quite interesting as well to see that this is indeed starting to shape up in several locations. So I think this is certainly an opportunity for this project to build on and to expand. I see also that citizen science is a participatory experience which in Mozambique is being used as well in Kirimba's Biosphere Reserve. So they also see there maybe some interest for collaboration on that. And also in South Africa, the Water Research Commission is developing tools for citizen science monitoring. And it's important to note that this includes endemic tools that rural communities have access to. So I think this is certainly a timely a moment to start looking at those technologies for the Biosphere Reserves and see how we can pilot them in some of those locations. I would just try to give one more opportunity to Waterberg to talk, and maybe we can give them the microphone if they can unmute and ask the question. And we probably would like to wrap up because it's becoming already quite late. So after the question, I think we can finalize here. And of course, you can always drop us questions by email. We would happily answer them. So the last question maybe to Waterberg Biosphere Reserve, if they can unmute. Can you help them unmute? Or is there unmute them? You did. I did it, but we need to permit. Okay. Right, so they have to, from your side, you have to unmute or give permission to unmute from here so that we can have you live. If not, you can still put your question in the chat box and we can take it from there. At the same time, I think we would want to move on. So if not, we would go to the next session, which is the way forward, just two slides to say what's coming next, so that you know what you can expect from us. So we can put the next slide. The next slide. All right. So basically, we have today the kickoff meeting. I think it was quite successfully attended by many colleagues in the region. So we also know that we couldn't cover the full details of the conversation. And in a real live situation, we would have had separate breakout sessions. We would have sit together with you and identify activities that we could set up together with you. So in this sense, we will split that now in webinars where we go more in depth of each topic. And in fact, the first one is currently scheduled for the 28th of July, with others following in September. We'll see if those dates will be maintained in the next few days, but at least we will invite everybody who has registered to be part of that and to have a more in-depth discussion on each of the topics where we would like to have activities implemented in the next 3 years. So this certainly is an interactive conversation. Although, of course, we provided a lot of information today, this is actually just a starting point for drilling down on specific activities you would like to see. And the next slide, just to finalize that way forward, is that we, of course, are very cognizant of the fact that physical meetings may still lie in the future, And in fact, we are, of course, bound to move ahead. And one way of doing that is to ensure that we can do online learning for capacity building. So part of the project, of course, deals with capacity building and understanding how this information can be useful. So in this sense, we build a new platform for online courses that will be shortly available, and that already will host one of the courses that we discussed today, which is on climate risk informed decision analysis, which should be available probably by the end of July, and we will launch it in early September. So this is also our platform where we can have more frequent webinars dedicated to specific topics, and where we can actually build together with you a narrative and a database on knowledge that is relevant for the biosphere reserves in the region. So with that, I can give you some perspective on the next steps. And I just would like to invite the donor and our colleague, Martial, head of the natural sciences sector, to give two closing remarks. So first, please, Mr. Gijzen, maybe you can just close the meeting from your perspective and provide some closing remarks.
Yes, thank you. I would like to thank all of the participants and all of the presenters for a very interesting kickoff meeting, where we see that the science is really ready to be applied in the field. And for us, I think it's very important that this becomes an open science type collaboration, where all the partners in the field and the science advisors can have a dialogue with each other to find out the right solutions that work for the areas that we're working on in this particular project. In Europe, we have a very strong drive towards more open science approaches. UNESCO is at the highest level trying to formulate general recommendations on open science, and this is a typical case of an open science project. So I thank you all for all your interest and your efforts, and I'm very pleased that we've had this very interesting afternoon, and hopefully the technical difficulties of meeting in online will not dampen our enthusiasm, nor would it affect the interactions, because it's really indeed important that knowledge from the ground also inspires the project rollout. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Geert, for those words. And I just would like to finalize the meeting with giving the words to Dr. Sebastien Martial. He's the head of natural science sector here in the UNESCO Regional Office for Southern Africa.
Thank you, Koen, for the kind words. Distinguished participants, we have reached the end of the Biosphere project launch. You certainly agree with me that it has been very exciting, listening to all the presentations covering the whole spectrum: water, climate change, adaptation, disaster risk reduction, including early warning systems, and then the seasonal forecasting. Of course, citizen science has also been discussed as a possible way of addressing some of these challenges. For instance, leveraging the low-cost hardware, such as the Arduino or microcontroller, to build sensors which are capable of monitoring and data gathering. Now, as it has been reiterated, the complex challenges that our communities are facing due to climate-induced extreme events call for kind of collaborative effort in addressing them. Please be assured that UNESCO will continue to work with all the stakeholders in looking for innovative solutions to mitigate the impact of climate change. The Gijzen project will empower the Biosphere Reserve to act not only as the observatories, but also as laboratories for climate change adaptation in Southern Africa. We do hope that the pilot tools that the project will be developing will be replicated in other parts of the region. Finally, distinguished participants, on behalf of the Regional Director of the UNESCO Regional Office for Southern Africa, Professor Hubert, I would like to thank the representative from the Flanders government, the Afrima Chair and Coordinator for Southern Africa, government officials, secretaries general for UNESCO national commissions, dear managers, Brazilian partners, and all the participants are attendees. Your presence and contribution have been invaluable, and without any doubt have helped make the event a great success. I would like also to congratulate and thank all the ROSA team, the science team, for the hard work to make this work, to make this conference a success. Participants, I will look forward to seeing you again in subsequent webinars and working with you in the context of the resilient and beyond that. Thank you all and have a great evening.
Thank you very much, Marcel. And I think with those words, we can conclude this seminar and this Be Resilient launch meeting. Of course, do reach out to us if you have any additional questions, and we, of course, will follow up with you to ensure you will be engaged in all follow-up activities. Thank you very much. Have a good evening, and I will hope to see you soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.